Simon & Schuster Audio presents My Story, written by Sarah, the Duchess of York, with Jeff Copeland. Read by Sarah, the Duchess of York.
I would like to dedicate this audio program to Beatrice and Eugenie, the two little lives that keep my life together, and to Jeffrey Copeland, who kept me together and made this happen. Of all the Queen's homes, Balmoral Castle is so special. With its ivied walls and slender turrets, it stands like some friendly colossus on the Scottish Highlands. It was the royal family's summer home, a place for languid days and light labour. For me it was the perfect haven, a staunch fortress against the arrows loosed my way since I entered Buckingham Palace in 1986. Balmoral was a tonic for the senses. I loved the crackle of its morning frost and the smells of its heather and peaty soil, so delicious and earthy. Even the water there was brown from the peat carried down from the mountains by the rushing River Dee. I loved most of all how Balmoral relaxed the man I had married, Prince Andrew, the Duke of York. On this vast estate my husband felt sprung from glaring eyes and incessant protection. He could drive about its acreage without a policeman at his side. He became easy and full of gentle fun, his truest self, and it was so lovely to see. If ever that prince and that family needed a respite, it was in August of 1992. The Queen would later call it Annus Horribilis, the year of torn moorings and shattered peace. In April, Princess Anne entered divorce proceedings against Captain Mark Phillips. In June came the first published excerpts of Diana, Her True Story, a tabloid-flavoured rendering of the Princess of Wales's bulimia, suicide tries, and marital problems with Prince Charles. Not one to be left out, I had my own bit to contribute. From early on that year, Andrew and I had been discussing our own separation, not because we'd stopped caring for one another, but because I had reached the end of my royal rope. For 6 years I had shouldered the demands of palace life. I had endured the constant scrutiny of the British press, and the barely veiled hostility of the royal household, the courtiers who run the show. Gradually, relentlessly, they had beaten me down. They were killing me by inches. It was time to save my life. In March, our plan to separate was leaked prematurely to the Daily Mail, that blunt instrument of a newspaper. A senior courtier publicly blamed me for the leak, an utter falsehood, and proceeded to flog me up and down. The BBC knew a hot story when it fell into one, and announced that the knives were out for Fergie in the palace. There were prompt apologies, but the damage had been done. I was tagged unsuitable for royal life, and the charge stuck. I was frozen out, and not just in the palace. The wind from all the doors slamming in my face might have knocked me over. A stronger person might have lashed back in righteous anger, but then a stronger person wouldn't have trapped herself in such a corner in the first place. Deep down I knew that the charge was fair. I was unsuitable, always had been. Even at my dizzy height of popularity, I knew that the clock would strike 12 and I'd be seen for what I was. Unworthy, unattractive, unaccomplished. And finally, logically, undone. As usual, I had it coming. Just a week before, I'd been on holiday near Saint-Tropez with John Bryan, an American who started out as my financial advisor, then became something more. The timing was rotten, too close to Balmoral and my time there with Andrew, a man I still loved. It felt wrong from the beginning, but I'd long since short-circuited my intuition. But while our holiday was misguided, even reckless, it was not as indiscreet as would be made out. We took reasonable precautions, a private plane to a private airstrip, a rented villa on a 10-acre estate, 2 miles off the highway. As Beatrice and Eugenie were with me, we also had a pair of royal protection officers at our side. As princesses who are 5th and 6th in line to the throne, my young daughters are always safeguarded regardless of my marital status. Ringed by densely wooded hills and vineyards, the villa was naturally secluded. Still, I felt twinges of something amiss. As I sunbathed by the pool without a top, I said to my friend Gabriel, "I have this extraordinary feeling of being watched, and I don't know where it's coming from." Then I felt silly and paranoid. The soft heat of the Côte d'Azur will lull one's suspicions into deep slumber. After a day back in London, my daughters and I boarded a flight to Aberdeen to join Andrew and his family in Balmoral. I had been lurching in a fog since March, not knowing which end was up. But Scotland began to work its emerald wonder, to remind me that life was a dance, not a dirge. On Tuesday I took the first of many calls from John Brown. "I'm afraid they've got photographs of our trip to France," he said. Rights had been bought by the Daily Mirror, one of the heavier-breathing tabloids. As a grand master of self-destruction, I knew disaster when I saw it, even if I saw it only after the fact. I listened as John went on, in that smooth, humming way of his. "Now you relax, honey. I'll take care of it. Everything will be fine. I'm going to the High Court, and we'll stop them there." I told Andrew straight away. I never held back from him. We were always honest with each other. Andrew said, "I will completely support you. I knew that John was down there, and that's our business and no one else's." I went up with heavy feet to brief the Queen. She couldn't have been pleased, but she's like her middle son. She's not easily rattled. "All right, let us see what happens," she said. On Wednesday I got half a dozen updates from John, each one grimmer than the last. The High Court refused to grant an injunction, failing to see how blocking the photographs would serve the public interest. But there was one last hope, John reported. If the palace were to back us before the Press Complaints Commission, we could still prevent the Mirror from publishing the next morning. I forced myself to stick to routine, but all day I felt enveloped by a black buzzing, a swarming dread as thick as sparrows. At 10 o'clock that evening, John called one last time. The deadline had passed, and the Queen's private secretary, Mr. Z, had refused to intercede. I will forgo using his name, not to be mysterious, but because his name doesn't matter. Like all the top courtiers, he was a creature of the palace establishment, no more and no less. John had got hold of the Mirror's first edition. There were 20-odd photographs, all of them set by the scalloped-edged pool at our villa, and they were worse than he had thought. Neither John nor I were the least bit fuzzy or out of focus. "I'm sorry, baby," John said. There was simply nothing we could do. I set the phone back on its handset. With the halting voice of a crash victim, I relayed the news to Andrew. "Don't worry, we'll just deal with it," he said. This prince rises to adversity. As a helicopter pilot in the Falklands War, he accepted the most dangerous of assignments, to serve as decoy for enemy missiles. He is brilliant under fire, in a drama, and that is the word he used that night in Balmoral. Brilliant, he told me. As in, you are still wonderful to me. We will not let them defeat us. But I did not feel brilliant. I had a glass of brandy to cushion my fall into shock, and fall I did, to the centre of the earth. I could not face the family at breakfast, and Andrew went down to the dining room in my stead. The Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh had their breakfast upstairs, but my husband's siblings were there. Charles, the heir to the throne, Anne, the Princess Royal, Edward, the youngest, plus all the children, and an equerry and a lady-in-waiting or two. It would be accurate to report that the porridge was getting cold. Eyes wide and mouths ajar. The adults were flipping through the Daily Mirror and the rest of the tabloids, until they saw Andrew and stopped. as it never feels quite right to be gazing at your brother's wife when she hasn't all her clothes on. All watched for Andrew's reaction as he went to the newspapers. But he must have been such a disappointment. He casually leafed through them as though digesting the cricket results. Then he brought a copy up to my room, and I faced the music I'd composed. John was right. It was the work of a professional. The photographs were sharp and clear, in garish living colour, and they strongly suggested that our friendship was more than platonic. I'd been exposed, body and soul. I'm a more private person than most people know, and a part of me expired that morning. The Mirror's headline, in typical hydrogen bomb type, read, "Fergie's Stolen Kisses." Nearly the entire front page was swallowed by 2 photographs, and there were more photographs plastered over 9 pages inside. The Mirror had reportedly spent upwards of $100,000 for its booty, and was out to get their money's worth. The shot that caused the most furore, the one that would define me for years to come, showed John planting his mouth on the top of my foot. "Toe-sucking," went the tabloid's refrain, and you could almost hear the grown men giggling. For the record, no sucking of toes had taken place in the south of France, a fact soberly acknowledged by the Los Angeles Times. "That does not now appear to be the case," they wrote. John and I were actually playing at Cinderella when the picture was snapped. The whole scene was not nearly as intense as it was made to look. But if you read the Mirror's own back-patting editorial, you might have thought they had fingered a serial killer or busted some treasury-sapping racket. The poolside photographs, the paper pronounced, strip away all the lies, humbug and hypocrisy that have surrounded the Duchess's relationship with Mr. Bryan. But the horror wasn't nearly over. I still had to face the woman by whose kind permission I was staying in this castle. She was my mother-in-law, and my sovereign, and a woman I cared about deeply. And this was how I had thanked her? I had let down a person who had never let me down, the last person in the world I'd ever wished to disappoint. At 9:30 that morning, I went up to see Her Majesty, the Queen. The Queen was furious. I had apologized, of course, but penance and contrition have their limits. There are some things which cannot be put right. Her anger wounded me to the core, the more because I knew she was justified. I had violated her trust. I managed to mount some feeble defense, instead of just slinking out of her room. I said, "Don't you think it's a bit weird that it keeps having to be me that gets caught? Don't you think it's time someone asked, why is it always her? I can't be that idiotic." Later that day, the Queen and Andrew authorized Mr. Z to release the following statement to the press. "We strongly disapprove of the publication of photographs taken in such circumstances." I curtsied my retreat, then went and found the one woman who understood what it meant to marry into the royal family, and how hard it was to measure up. I went up to Diana's bedroom and sat with my friend. She couldn't say anything. She was just there for me, and she was great. For the rest of the day, I sought out other family members and apologized to them, one by one. By early afternoon, I needed another brandy, but I saw the gauntlet through. They were all very gracious. They all knew that I wasn't the first person in the annals of royalty to be caught in an indiscretion. Still and all, I was levelled when I entered the room for dinner and saw everyone staring at me. I knew they must be seeing me topless, or being nuzzled by a bald American. The courtiers eyed me sneakily, discreetly. The butlers and footmen gaped, and I felt naked in their sight. I would need a Roget's to express my degradation at that moment, and even then I would fail. There are no words for it. On Sunday, my getaway day, the tabloids carried a fresh scandal. Diana's so-called squidgy tape, 20 minutes of phone chat with a male friend. I wasn't the only one being spied on. That much was clear. I went into Diana's room and thanked her for taking me off the front page. It was our own private, rueful joke. I took half a Valium, the only time I ever used it in my life. Then I flew back with my daughters to London, with no clue as to what the next day would bring. To take stock, I was a non-person in the family. Any future I might have had there was now irrevocably ended. I had lost my husband, whom I loved unconditionally and who loved me back the same way. I had squandered the British public's esteem, a hard loss for a person who lived to please. To make matters worse, I was building a mountain of debt. As a single mother with few assets and less income than most presumed, I was in deep financial trouble, though of course I would never admit it. In short, I had reached my crossroads. The choice was stark. I could race on in the same old direction, keep binging on food and spending and work and carrying on. I could just let my life happen, make it up as I went along, and hope I stayed ahead of the sheriff. That was the road I knew, the one more travelled on. It was also the route to insanity, or certainly an early grave. The other path was new to me, and by far the more frightening. It was a slower, broader road, and it led to the deepest part of me, the best part. But to get there, I would have to put myself back together, when all the king's horses and all the king's men had already written the job off. Most of all, I'd have to face my pain. And my pain had always beamed like the sun to me, far too intense and enormous to look at for long. I was only 32 years old, but I sensed that my next wrong turn really could be my last. Would I learn what I needed to solve my own riddle? And before it was too late? On Fleet Street, and in the stale, hushed corridors of Buckingham Palace, the betting was sure against me. Of course, we should note, however, that those widely esteemed and supremely well-connected and oh-so-powerful gentlemen had underestimated me before. Many are the things I love about horses. They are large and safe, and they never answer back. I love the way they smell, but I am one for whom smells are very important, who follows her nose. And I adore horses' high spirits, their capacity to be difficult, and the way they fall in line when you show them who's boss. But as a child growing up in the shires of southern England, what I loved most about my horses was their loyalty, their consistency, and their true companionship. They were my secret sharers, my touchstones. And for a good while, they seemed almost enough to make me happy. At my first home, Lowood, a big white Edwardian house in Berkshire, we were a 40 minutes drive from London and right in the middle of horse country. We had 14 acres and 2 makeshift wooden stables. By age 3, I had advanced from my painted rocking horse to a real Dartmoor pony. With my sister Jane, 2 years older and my best friend, I'd play pretend for hours in the garden, with Jane as the driver and myself as the horse, snorting and prancing or pointing my toes like a proper show pony. Or we'd watch the great show-jumping riders on television and clamour for our favourites. Horses were everywhere in my childhood. They were part of our landscape. Though heavily Irish on both sides, my family tree claimed its quota of blue blood, with 4 dukes and at least 3 mistresses of Charles II. My father, Major Ronald Ferguson, hailed from a long line of distinguished gentlemen soldiers. My mother, the former Susan Wright, came from an established family in Ireland. They once owned a grand estate near Dublin called Portscourt, which boasted the tallest waterfall in the British Isles. By the time I came around, we were country gentry with a bit of old money, but assuredly not landed aristocracy. You wouldn't put me in the same category as a certain 4th cousin of mine, Lady Diana Spencer, who came out of a big ancestral home with a title in her own right. Still, we had a quite comfortable life, with a small household staff and trips to the seaside in the summer and Switzerland in the winter. In 1969, after my grandfather died of leukemia, Dad's inherited a dairy farm called Dumadan, over the county line in Hampshire, and we moved out to the real country. I was 9 years old and found all of it wonderful. For Jane and myself, the most exciting part of rural life was our expanded pony operation. In the spacious yard by the Dummer farmhouse, I would thrill to the sight of a dozen or more horses, most of them in training for dads. My grandfather, Colonel Andrew Ferguson, had distinguished himself as commanding officer of the Life Guards, the Queen's household cavalry. My father had set out on the same track and had served several postings in the Middle East. When his military career stalled, Dad's resigned his commission in the Life Guards, took on part-time work in public relations, and immersed himself in his one true passion, polo, the game he had taken up while stationed in the Suez Canal zone in Egypt. At 6'2", broad of shoulder and square of jaw, Dad's was known on the field for his length and strength. He became a very useful 5-goal player. Through polo, he met the Earl of Mountbatten and then Mountbatten's nephew, Prince Philip, for whom he eventually ran the Guards Polo Club. He later became Prince Charles's polo manager. As a result, Jane and I had frequent opportunities to practice our curtsies before the royal family. They were not some remote abstraction. We considered them friends of our parents. Mum was really a tremendous horsewoman in her own right, who'd win her share of side saddle and working hunter competitions at the local shows. Jane was a miniature version of Mum, the same lithe frame, soft brown hair, stunning features, and really very graceful in the saddle. And then I came along, barreling ahead with my mop of tight red curls and my galaxy of freckles. I was a wild child, a total tomboy, the son my father never had. I hated all physical constraint. The baggier my dungarees, the better. When we rode cross-country, I'd go flat out, my horse jumping everything clear. I might not be the prettiest rider, but I'd get to the final fence in the best time. My mother had herself been raised in the classic British fashion, to display world-class manners and submerge all emotion. My father, moulded by military discipline, was the dean of stiff upper lips. From early on I came to dread their disapproval. Mum would admonish me thus: "When I tell you off, why can't you just accept the criticism and say you're sorry, and then forget all about it?" I so craved their affirmations, the big smile or the murmured "well done," that I took Mum's advice straight to heart. They would scarcely reach mid-reprimand, in public or private. It made absolutely no difference, before I'd be making my amends. "Okay, fine, quite right, yep, absolutely, I shouldn't have done that, wasn't I a silly fool?" And sure enough, they would stop. Life was easier that way. I wanted to be loved by everyone. I wanted to be the nicest, the kindest, the most clever, the most able. My parents' marriage was already cracking by the time I was born. I was the child who would cork the fishers. It was my job to make Mummy and Daddy happy. It's an impossible job, of course, but if you're a child like me, you think you can do it, somehow. I became the pleaser. I was always the pleaser. In the summer of 1972, my parents flew out on holiday to the Ionian island of Corfu. There, Mum met an Argentinian named Hector Barrantes, and the ensuing quake would rattle Damadan and the lives of all who lived there. A one-time rugby star and Golden Gloves heavyweight, Hector was an 8-goal player at polo, one of the very best in the world. He was large and round and powerful. As his patron Lord Vestiaire once put it, Hector was a great bear of a man who used polo sticks like telegraph poles. They called him El Gordo, the fat man. But when he got on a horse, he lost 50 pounds. He rode with such touch and finesse. At that time, Hector was also a terribly lonely man. He had recently lost his wife, 8 months pregnant, in a car wreck. When he met my mum, they connected with the power of things preordained. At summer's end, my parents came home together, but really apart. Mum was ripe for a big change. I had seen it building in her for some time. I never heard my parents argue. Mum was never unhappy like that. Only there would be fewer of her sunbeam smiles and more of her time spent riding out of the house. She organised one last family Christmas, complete with paper hats and crackers and much contrived jollity. Soon thereafter, she began shuttling to London, where my family owned a small house in Chelsea, and to trips with Hector. By the following autumn she would move out of Dummer, for good. In the meantime, I had my own transition and trauma to deal with. To that point, I'd been sheltered at Daneshill School, with close friends I still claim today. When it came time to pick a senior school for me in the fall of 1972, Daneshill was closing down. My parents settled on nearby Hurst Lodge, in Sunningdale, where Jane was already enrolled. I was to be a weekly boarder, with weekends back at Dummer, and I was devastated. My friends had moved on to St Mary's Wantage in Oxford, and what was wrong with me that I hadn't been accepted? Hurst Lodge was originally established as a ballet school. It had a strong drama division as well. Juliet Stevenson studied one form above me, and my best friend there was Florence Belmondo, daughter of Jean-Paul. When you have an adolescent weight problem, ballet school is not quite the place to be. Hurst Lodge was populated by a colony of sylph-like creatures, impossibly slim and supple, as they did their splits with mirrors everywhere. And yes, here came good old Fergie Form, bobbing along, wincing at her own reflection. It didn't help when I received the occasional chirpy letter from St Mary's Wantage. "We're all here having fun, Fergie. What are you up to?" Here is what I was up to. As my roommate Florence would attest, I was eating too many pieces of toast and crying myself to sleep. I lived for my weekends at Dummer, but these turned disappointing as well. It couldn't be nearly the same without Mum. It felt as though the colour had drained from our lives, as though we'd gone from Oz to Kansas. By the time of my 14th birthday, Jane mostly steered clear of the glum scene at Dummer. After leaving school for secretarial college, she minded a shop for a time and lived with Mum in our house in Chelsea. Soon she would flee further still to marry Alex, the lanky tractor driver who'd once built our equitation school, and settle on his sheep ranch in Australia. She was crying out, I think, for the same missing sustenance as I. But where Jane fled as far as she could go, I burrowed in deeper, to hunt blindly. For what? I just could not tell you. Dad's knew how I pined for Mum and all her small touches. But Dad's was over his head as a single parent. I know firsthand the demands of that role, and I'm sure he felt totally boggled by it. He was a very, very tough father. I didn't mind so much that he made me do my own washing and ironing and the cooking of our dinner. The chores kept me well grounded, and I'm glad of that today. It was much more than just strictness with Dad's. He had his own agenda, and if he didn't want to do something, he'd dismiss it. The dark side of that integrity I had admired. When my demands became a bore, he would call me selfish and spoiled, and, the hated word, an encumbrance. Like many fathers, Dad's underrated the weight of his words. He didn't intend to put me down, for he was not a cruel man. His reproaches were born of fatigue and a leaden sadness, heavier still for being unspoken. But we are literal-minded as children. I looked up to my father completely, and so I took it on board that I was selfish and spoiled, and a total encumbrance to people when I was 13. I would never stop believing it, actually. I received those hurtful words like doctrine, held on to them like faith. The saving grace of that hellish era was my grandmother, the Honourable Doreen Wright, that dynamic, chain-smoking, fiercely loyal woman whom Jane and I knew as Grummy. Then well into her 70s, Grummy came to help look after me on weekends after Mum, her baby daughter, had left her ex-son-in-law, as Grummy referred to him. She and Dad's were very close, and she would allow no one, Mum included, to say one nasty word about him. Unconditional love was a core principle for Grummy, and I was a prime beneficiary. She'd been a hard, unyielding mother with Mum, and there was still no getting one over on her. But we could talk about anything, from religion to the pill. From Grummy I learned the grace of life, the treasure of each moment, the great importance of manners, and the urgency of goodness, the prize of humility and the necessity of compassion. When I was feeling down and fat and lonely, she taught me to train my sights outward. Her favourite prayer was from St. Francis of Assisi. Seek to love, not to be loved. Seek to understand, not to be understood, and so on. Slowly, I did come to understand that it was self-indulgent to sink into misery, that I must give to others to find my own happiness. Don't always wish for more, Grummy would tell me. That was her creed, a noble and enduring one, and of course a perfect tool for the pleaser. But St. Francis had his limits. He could inspire great deeds and lofty thoughts, but he could not help me find out who I was in those bitter, tear-stained days. Or, more crucially, what on earth was I meant to do? Late in 1973, my parents were divorced. Mum and Hector were married a year later, and that was that. If you are really good at pleasing people, if you put their concerns before your own, you can become quite the popular person. In my 4th year at Hurst Lodge, I was voted head girl, the equivalent of class president. Yet despite my apparent acceptance in school, I never felt I quite fit in. At the end of that school year, I left Hurst Lodge for good, though without any sense of completion. I felt utterly aimless. I had no specific ambition, no notion of what to do next. My classmates wondered about their head girl too. If one sentiment scrawled in my yearbook was indicative, "So don't worry, Sarah, things are never as black as they seem." I packed up and came home to Dummer. I found comfort in pushing my pony hard through the fields, riding for the freedom of it. When I was galloping, wholly in the moment, no one and nothing could catch me. I could even outrun my loneliness. But you cannot gallop forever. That summer, shortly after my sister's wedding, I set off on that time-honoured interlude before I was meant to settle into humdrum respectability, the trip abroad. I spent 5 months with Mum and Hector at his estancia in Argentina. The air was pure and the sky unbroken. I could breathe again. I galloped world-class polo ponies and flirted with the gauchos. But most of all, I went everywhere with Mum and Hector. I loved how they were together, how Mum had retrieved her magic. I had adored Hector from the start. He was so warm and gentle with me, so large and cuddly. One of the first men I had felt comfortable hugging. It was just as Hector had told me at the start. "I'm not your father. I'm not your stepfather. I'm simply your friend." After a 5-month reprieve, it was back to England to sort out my future. Or, much more accurately, to find some respectable niche for my holding pattern. Dad's announced that I would go to Winkfield Place, where I'd learn to fix flowers and cook a meal without ptomaine. Winkfield was one of those fashionable venues for up-and-coming Sloane Rangers, that well-connected set of smug, socially ambitious preppies. It was the perfect place to become the perfect young lady and hence the model trophy wife. Well, I might not have known what I wanted to do, but I certainly knew that I did not want that. Some tiny voice inside peeped out that a finishing school was no place for a person who'd yet to find her starting gate. Dad's put his foot down, but with an option. I was bound either for Winkfield Place or Secretarial School. One or the other, take it or leave it. I took Queen's Secretarial College in South Kensington, the lesser of two evils, though not by much. At Queen's, the highest virtues were neatness and subservience. I was uneven on the first count and impossible on the second. I would not conform. I copied off my neighbour's shorthand and cheated on my typing tests, and when I really got vexed, I threw 2 of those antique pecking machines straight out the second-floor window and into a dumpster below. I'm really surprised that I wasn't expelled. I graduated in December 1977 with a reasonable typing speed and several fines for breaking typewriters. "Bright, bouncy redhead," went my final report, in a tone that could send you to strangle someone. "She's a bit slapdash, but she has initiative and personality, which she will use to her advantage when she gets older." The bouncy redhead herself wasn't quite so optimistic. As I wrote to my sister Jane, "What is the point in going on?" I entered the working world with a well-used Mini Clubman estate, a boxy little car handed down from my step-grandfather, and an allowance of $150 a month from Dad's. I would need to survive on what I earned, and was proud of that, though it really wouldn't be easy. I took a temp job at a flat-sharing agency before hiring on as a secretary at a public relations firm in Knightsbridge. My starting salary was $6,000 a year. I hurled myself into the whirl of London, into the wine bars and restaurants and music clubs, and into the dating game that threw me for a loop. I had no clue what I was doing or how I should be doing it. Shall I ring him today or ring him tomorrow? Will he ever ring me again? Should we go to the Italian place or the French bistro? To the reggae bar or the disco? What was right? I'd get poleaxed by indecision, unable to do anything without 3 outside opinions, begging for reassurance, trusting none of it. Who would give me the time and care to help show me the way? Mum wasn't there and Dad's was too busy. By then he had remarried to a wise and gentle woman, and I rang my stepmother, Susan, about 5 times a day, until Dad's would get exasperated and tell me I was being a bore. In 1980, I dropped everything and set off with a good friend on another New World journey. We spent 6 months travelling through South America and the US. Not in grand style, I might add. We travelled by bus, sometimes sleeping in the stations, and we supported ourselves by working at youth hostels and strudel shops and that sort of thing. When I returned to London, everyone assumed I would have my own flat, like other girls from my background with rich enough families. But our family's house in Chelsea had since been sold, and I rented a room for $50 a week from Carolyn Beckwith-Smith. The 2 of us shared a small 2-bedroom south of the Thames. Number 40 Lavender Gardens was a nondescript brick townhouse like thousands of others in south-west London. I had a single bed and a chest of drawers, and a bathroom around the corner, and that was it. But I also had Carolyn, my best friend, my guardian angel. She had the patience of Job, and every day she listened to my problems, which were as legion and twisted as ever. I might have seen a fair swath of the world, but still I was far from worldly. I was looking for work, and I saw a listing for a personal assistant at an art gallery in Covent Garden. 28 and over apply. I rang up and said, I'm not 28, I'm 21, but you do need me. I know I'm perfect for this job, and I'm coming down for an interview. Such amazing boldness. I seemed so confident and strong that they hired me on the spot. It was a lesson I'd keep resisting, that when I went after what I wanted, I could indeed make myself happy. My new boss was a lanky perfectionist named Bill Drummond. Like Hector, he really talked to me. He'd launch into long and passionate discussions. He opened my eyes to look at pictures in a different way, to take in the wealth of colour and form in the world. I must have done a good job, as I stayed on for 4 years. I should have had a great time, but I couldn't really enjoy myself, couldn't quite relax. Deep in the sanctum of myself, I knew I was letting someone down. Most of my friends were account executives, or some such, so I had to be falling short in Dad's eyes. Now I think he was quite proud of me, though he never would show it. And though I worked so hard to please my boss, I chronically worried that I had bungled some invoice or muffed a press release. It was ridiculous, really, but I just couldn't help myself. I had horrific migraines, aggravated no doubt by the stress of juggling my meagre finances. Though I took a second job on Saturdays as a salesperson in a maternity shop, my ends barely met. I piled up parking tickets by the handful. I was rushing around, no time to check the meters. There was no way I could pay them off and cover my share of the phone bill. Some mornings there would be a knock on the door from the parking Gestapo. Is Miss Ferguson in, please? We have a summons for her. And I'd say, no, I'm very sorry, she's gone to work, and ease the door shut on them. What money I had went toward tanning salons, restaurants and jazz bars. There was very little cash left for my wardrobe, which was definitely bohemian, sort of upscale Salvation Army. I could brush up quite nicely if I wanted to, however, with clothes lent by my angelic stepmother. And some brushing up was called for whenever I got hooked into that notorious Sloane Ranger preserve, the shooting weekend in the country. The Sloanes are quite an astounding species. They will give our future anthropologists a run for their money. What makes them special and distinct is that they find they are frightfully upper class when they actually are not, and so they must try harder than those at the very top. The court at Buckingham Palace is full of them, but more on that later. They all went to the same boarding schools where little Muffy and Daphne played frightfully well, and became lifelong chums or muckers. Their dress code was rigid, if eccentric. Laura Ashley shirts with a frill-up top and pearls over the frill, a cardi over the shoulders, tweedy skirts trailing down near the calf, navy blue tights, practical shoes without heels, slightly scruffy, in other words, but expensive. The shooting weekend would start on Friday with, "Are you getting a lift down with Henry?" And you would get a lift down to the country house that afternoon, where you'd been invited to stay because Camilla's mummy and daddy were giving a little dance on Saturday night. You would be offered a G&T on arrival. Would you like to take your drink up to your bath with you? After that you would change for dinner, but it was frightfully relaxed on Friday night, just trousers or a skirt and a shirt. Then it was, "Would you like breakfast in your room, or will you be down with the boys?" After Saturday breakfast would come the challenge that separated the more precious Lady Sloanes from the unvarnished man-hunters. "Will you be going out with the guns?" If you'd resolved to bite the bullet, as it were, you would pull on your corduroys and your green Wellington boots, and you would stand in the pouring rain for hours. That was the thing to be done. Then back to the house for a glass of sherry before lunch to ward off the grip, and then if you were really after the man, you would follow the guns out again to watch the sky rain dead pheasants. Back to the house for tea, then perhaps a bit of telly. It would be rather jolly to watch Blind Date or something like that. Then you'd go upstairs for a bath and another G&T, and you'd put on your long dress for Camilla's dance. For Sunday breakfast, at which you'd be dreadfully but comically hungover, you'd be treated to a lovely plate of kedgeree, an ensemble of rice and eggs and cream and fish all mixed together. It'd be awfully good, you know, thanks to the leftover salmon from dinner. Then it would be off for a morning constitutional and some fresh air before you drank your Bloody Mary over the Sunday papers. You'd pretend to be frightfully intelligent and digest the Sunday Times, and you hadn't the foggiest idea of what you were reading. If no one was watching, you might steal a glance at News of the World, Mummy and Daddy's grown-up equivalent of the comics. Would you like another bloody before lunch? You would have a huge lunch, eat far too much before you all piled in to drive back to London with Henry in his car. And on Monday you'd recount the lurid events to your office chums with a long-suffering but good-natured air. "It was frightful, I can't tell you what a bore. It rained the entire day, and then my dog Tiddle picked up the wrong birds." I confess to having spent shooting weekends with the Sloane Rangers and coming back for more. But the fact was that I never got along with the real British establishment. I had no patience for those arrogant twits who sat there with their fat tummies and pale faces and made huge whopping great statements on foreigners and morality. I never sought to gain entry into the right set. I had lots of different friends from different sets. I've always wanted a smorgasbord in life, not just a plate of kedgeree. I had Argentinian friends through Hector, and French friends through Florence Belmondo, and artist friends through Bill Drummond. And I had friends as well from the fast lanes of the Swiss Alps and of international motorcar racing. I first skied in Switzerland at the age of 4, when I'd stand between my mother's legs and whoop for more speed. As I grew older and more contained, stuck in my stairroom at her Slodge, then clogged by the fumes of Clapham, I longed for the tonic of Verbier. I would go into debt to fly there, but it was worth it. I felt loose and free, as though I'd shed my coat. It was in Verbier in 1982 that I found Paddy McNally. Some 20 years older than I, he had an immense chalet overlooking the town and hosted a continual round of parties and business dinners, all with superb wine. Paddy was probably Dad's worst nightmare. Not the right age, not in the household cavalry, just a man named McNally in motor racing. There she goes again. But I loved Paddy for all the things he wasn't, for the phony graces he rejected, the airs he'd refused to put on, even after he had done quite well for himself. He had a sharp, practical mind, a large and open heart. He was just himself, straight down the line. Through Paddy I also met Richard Burton, another urbane ex-racing driver, who now published fine art books. In 1984, I left the gallery in Covent Garden to become Richard's acquisitions editor in London. A dream opportunity. Though my salary was never much, topping off at 18,000 a year, I was virtually my own boss. I could set my own hours and spent a lot of time close to Richard's home base in Geneva. Here, surely, were the basics for fulfillment. A creative job with frequent travel, a mature man who cared about me, a widening circle of exciting friends. And yet I lived each day with anxiety. I always thought Paddy was going to dump me, and that to keep him I must be the perfect girlfriend. I desperately wanted to marry him, though I never dared to broach the subject. I still sought more, still hoped that someone out there could give me what I needed, not seeing that the incompletion lay most within myself. Given Dad's polo connections, my orbit continued to intersect the royal families every now and again. Also, I crossed paths with Diana the year before her wedding, during one of Charles's polo matches, when she was 19 years old and still teaching kindergarten. Our mothers had been in school together, when Mum and Frances held some legendary burping competitions. Diana and I hit it off, and soon we were lunching together once a week. I was invited to her wedding, and also to the occasional cast of thousands dance at Windsor Castle, for Andrew's 21st birthday, for example, and later for Edward's. But the big one came in the spring of 1985 when I found a heavy bond envelope in our postal slot. It was from Lieutenant Colonel Sir Blair Stuart Wilson, Deputy Master of the Royal Household, requesting the pleasure of your company at the Queen's house party at Windsor Castle during the week of Royal Ascot. Now I could make Coffee nervous. Royal Ascot required a real wardrobe, hats and gloves and real shoes and clothes that looked right together. I was in a state, and I didn't know what to do. I finally borrowed clothes from my ever-tolerant stepmother and had a few things stitched together. I just wasn't ready. I could never be ready for this, but here I came nonetheless. On Tuesday morning, June 18th, Paddy drove me the 20 miles to Windsor. He was like that. He would do anything for me that he could. A footman met us at the castle's private entrance to take my luggage. A lady-in-waiting led me through a maze of corridors to my room, a major bit of exercise. On my bedside table was a card embossed with the Queen's cipher, listing the 4-day schedule of meal times along with a seating plan for the day. For lunch I had been placed between a Vice-Admiral and Prince Andrew, then on leave from his duties on the HMS Brazen. More jitters. It was just my luck to be seated for lunch almost on top of the Prince, at the mercy of his famous needling. I had yet to suspect that matchmaker Diana had engineered all of this. I had seen Andrew on occasion before this weekend at Windsor, and one of those occasions had left me red-faced. We had been invited to the same weekend at Fleur's Castle, the regal home of the Duke and Duchess of Roxburgh. I had felt out of my depths, and when I walked down to Sunday breakfast, I silently cursed my heels as they squeaked on the wood floor. I entered the dining room, into a load of men with their newspapers. Morning, morning. And I longed to sit down quickly with my half-grapefruit and be ignored. I hurried toward a table with some newspapers, something I could hide behind, and there was Andrew standing next to me. So much for safe havens. I was ultra-nervous now, and as he reached across the table to get a paper, I somehow thought he was leaning toward me for a good morning kiss. So I gave him one, and he looked at me and said, "Oh, thank you so much." "Oh, I didn't mean to do that," I cried, which he must have found quite hilarious, really. It honestly hadn't been deliberate, just another Fergie fiasco. After that incident at Fleur's Castle, is it any wonder that I was a bit nervous at Windsor? I stepped into the green drawing room at 12:45 on the dot for drinks. At 1 p.m. I took my place at a table long enough for shuffleboard, 13 people on each side, one on each end. For the duration of the meal, conversation followed basic protocol. Following the Queen's lead, the ladies would speak to the man on their right, or their left, alternating with each course. When I turned to face Andrew, I was struck by how handsome he was in his morning suit, and soon my worries had flown. Andrew was easy, and I felt relaxed with him. For me, a rare condition, even though I addressed him as Sir, as per protocol. As I came to know Andrew that week, he seemed like a very charming, gentle giant who had sprung magically from the woodwork. Now a lamp shone into my forest, and I had been rescued by this great-looking man with a blinding smile. As Andrew would acknowledge months later, on television, our romance was no thunderbolt. It was more like a plant with good southern exposure, growing slowly but thriving by the day. On occasion I would join him for dinner at the palace. Other times he would park his green Jaguar, protection officer included, outside 40 Lavender Gardens, and we'd dine in my tiny kitchen. The locale didn't matter as long as Andrew returned my phone calls, and he did, every time. He was constant. He showed interest in me. What a remarkable phenomenon. At first it was hard to fathom that I was serving baked beans to the sovereign second son, but that distanced feeling soon passed. From a life lacking in all sureness and conviction, I began to feel confident of something huge. That I loved Andrew, and that he loved me back. I had dinner with Paddy that autumn and broke it off. He let me go freely and graciously. It was, I think, what he had hoped would come to pass, because he felt that Andrew was a better man for me, and that I should be with a younger person who could give me what I needed. For New Year's, Andrew invited me out to Sandringham, the Queen's private estate in Norfolk. We were getting serious, all right. A few weeks before, Andrew had asked me to address him by his first name. For 6 months I'd kept calling him Sir as per protocol, though more and more light-heartedly. Sandringham was my first time to be with just the family, though the royal family in all its genealogical extensions could fill a small auditorium. I'd been nervous before, but never like this. As my car pulled up the great drive, I had gravel fever. I wanted the gravel to be silent, so no one would know I had arrived. I hadn't worn a jersey, despite the cold, and my fright had left sweat rings on my smart silk shirt. Then Andrew staged his sneak attack. As I got out of my car on that first crisp day of 1986, he said, "I love you." I felt like jumping back in the car and getting out again, because I knew what I wanted to answer, but my tongue was knotted, and so I actually screamed. When Andrew laughed in response, I just crumbled at my knees. I still had to pass through the creaking front door. I still had to greet the family in its gigantic drawing room. My entrance was suitably grand. No sooner had Andrew brought me a drink than I tripped over the piano leg and sent it splashing over the sofa. Then, as I curtsied to the Queen, my boyfriend's mother, I kicked one of her dogs. It was a glancing blow, but corgis are a melodramatic breed, and you would have thought the little yapper was bound for the royal kennel in the sky. In February, travelling under an assumed name, I met Andrew for a tryst at Fleur's Castle. As snow began to fall that night, Andrew proposed, and I accepted with all my heart. Yet at the same time, I thought he must be somehow teasing, that he could not possibly mean it. And so in the most romantic moment of my life, I looked the man I loved straight in the eye and said, "If you wake up tomorrow morning, you can tell me it's all a huge joke." Whenever people promised me something, I always gave them an out, so they wouldn't feel trapped. Never be a nag or a bore, as Dad said. I honestly didn't want Andrew to regret what must have been some reckless impulse. Which is quite a large and sobering thing to look back at, that I had so little confidence, such a spindly sense of worth. To his credit, Andrew held firm the next morning. As the Queen was on an official tour in Asia, he couldn't get her permission for 3 weeks. A formality, but a real and legal one. In the meantime, our engagement would be our intimate secret, to be shared with no one. I rather liked that. I was an inordinately private person, anyway, about matters close to my heart. But true privacy, as I'd find upon my return to London, was but a memory. Ever since Sandringham, the press had suspected that something was afoot between Andrew and me, and now the Fergie beat was in full bloom. There were 8 major tabloids in London, and it seemed that each one had put a photographer on my case 24 hours a day. Few can understand what it is like to be an ordinary private person and then, overnight, to plunge into a public life. There were no stages to the process. It happened abruptly, relentlessly. Those photographers lodged by my doorstep each evening. When I drove to my small office in Mayfair, I would be trailed by 5 or 6 cars and a motorbike or 2. The journalists set upon my favourite coffee bar like urban anthropologists. They ferreted through my dustbin, found a sketch of my ruby engagement ring, and reproduced it. Did the same with some idle scrap of doodling. When I went to the palace to see Andrew, I would park at the tradesman's entrance and take the service lift up, quiet as a spy. If I really needed to fool them, I would hide in a laundry basket in the boot of Caroline's car, and she would take me where I needed to go. But for the most part, I didn't slink away from the press. I just went along. I had nothing to hide. I was just me, the country girl, and I'd fallen in love with this very sweet man who ate M&Ms off my table, and who happened to be a prince. I was a perfectly normal woman, pitched into an extraordinary situation. The classic fairy tale. In those giddy days leading up to my wedding, the press and I had much in common. We were both quite taken with this creation called Fergie. We both seemed to like her quite a bit, in fact. And we were both quite ready to rip her to pieces as soon as it came time to change the tune. On March 15, the Queen gave Andrew her consent. 4 days later, a delay which allowed the budget to go to the House of Commons and still get front-page play, our engagement was announced. I awoke with a withering migraine that day, but I perked up on cue for the BBC. With Andrew at my side, I felt at ease before the TV cameras. He taught me by example. I just watched him and then I jumped right in. From where I sit now, I was astoundingly naive. I told the interviewer that I'd keep working at my publishing job, of course, and how I would cope with all the new demands upon me. I could handle anything, because Andrew and I were a team, a good team, and nothing could defeat us. Fergie mania had exploded. When I walked that afternoon from my office to a nearby hotel, the herd nearly crushed a woman bystander into a railing. Policemen lined the street to keep some semblance of order. I had slept my last night in Lavender Gardens. My old routines would be too dicey now. The next morning I would wake up in Buckingham Palace, and Andrew's personal protection officer would drive me to work in my man's Jaguar, with a police car tight behind us. I'd never felt so alive and open to adventure, and yet so totally safe. That feeling filled me up. It stilled all my yearning, left no room for discontent. I could neatly sidestep the obvious question, the one that would swell inside me like an aneurysm, till it nearly burst and did me in. What on earth am I doing here? Over the 4 months that led up to our wedding, I swept along with the tide. Every person I met seemed powerful to me. The ladies-in-waiting, the protection men, even the housemaids. I figured they must know what to do as they'd all been at it much longer than I. I followed their advice without question. Wouldn't that be the way to please them, to win their acceptance? Most of all, I looked to my fiancé. My first official engagement came in April, Daffodil Day, the Queen's birthday. I was slightly panicked and moaned to Andrew, "What do I say? What do I do?" And Andrew, who was trained for this from birth, simply said, "You'll learn." And I learned. Had no idea what to do, but I did it. I can manage fine. I'll be on the balcony, right here I am on the balcony. Fergie thrived on challenges, everyone knew that. I stood on that palace balcony. The massed faces blurred below me, my spectacular almost in-laws all around me, and I smiled very bravely and waved very gingerly. Good technique for the royal wave, I deduced, was like screwing a light bulb. It was all in the wrist. But soon my inner voices lost their cool elan. Wave, don't wave, oh my gosh, Andrew, what did I just do? Has anyone noticed I don't really belong here? As my wedding day approached, I lived in a frenzy, rising early and late to bed. I buzzed through a whirl of appointments and consultations. I was on the royal wedding dart. There was no time to eat. I would start at 7 in the morning with a massage or an acupuncture for my trick back, a legacy of my breakneck riding days. Then I'd meet with my dress creator, Linka Chirac, for a fitting, and then with the bridesmaids and the florist. There were inquisitions to be fielded about china and glass and cutlery. I had to appear expert about things I'd never really thought about before. Presents poured in from all over the world, 2,000 by the end, so many that they were stored in the palace ballroom, which is roughly the size of Madison Square Garden. One little lady up north crocheted a tablecloth for us, and I thought how many hours went into that gift, how much generosity of heart. I received these people's love as a sweet echo of Andrew's. For a bride, it was a feeling to float on. The night before my wedding, I slept for 2 hours. I woke before 7 with fuzzy sight in my right eye. Oh no, I knew what was coming, and soon enough here it was, a killer migraine, the monster child of all the pressure I'd soaked up and repressed. In the middle of breakfast the troops began rolling in. The hairdresser, the manicurist, the beautician, with Lincolnshire on hand to advise on the makeup to best complement my dress, her mum there for moral support. Fortunately, I had caught my headache in time and taken my pills, so the pounding was no worse than a Sousa march at 20 paces. My headdress, a fragrant crown of gardenias, Andrew's favourite flower, was affixed. My veil was arranged. I was inserted into my ivory wedding dress, an exquisite creation I'd lost £26 to fit into. A few minutes after 11, the gates of Clarence House swung open to release a matched pair of bay horses and their special freight, the glass coach, so named for the large windows on either side. There were but 2 passengers, myself and my father, who looked moderately dashing in his own father's dark green morning coat. The crowd outside loosed into a raucous version of Here Comes the Bride. We made our ceremonious way along the Mall to Westminster Abbey. With nearly 1 million people lining the 1-mile route, Dads looked desperately flustered. But I was just cruising, screwing light bulbs right and left. It isn't so hard to enjoy mass adoration. The tricky part is understanding that it has nothing to do with you, and that it rarely outlives an English summer. But on my wedding day, all I knew or cared about was that Fergie was in glorious vogue. And as for Sarah, that ugly, valueless, unglamorous creature, no one had seen or heard from her for some time, which was just as I wanted it. As we reached the Abbey's west door, Linker and Dads made some final adjustments to my dress. A 17-foot train is not easy to keep straight, and to my floral coronet. We took our places, heard the first notes of the processional. It was time to start down the aisle for Dads to give me away. It was that poignant moment between father and daughter, a time for poetry and murmured tenderness. And here is what my romantic Dad said to me as I lifted my satin slipper. "Let the horse take the strain." As in, trot on, old girl. Of course he meant it as a joke. Do I look like a horse then? That was my first thought. But then I reminded myself how nervous he must be. "It'll be all right, Dads," I said, and we were off. I stayed calm. I was anesthetized, really, right up to when Robert Runcie looked at me with his big eyes to lead me through my vows. In that moment, the immensity of it all pierced my cloud of cool. My nerves kicked in. I'd been drilling my lines, and in particular Andrew's middle names, to wit, Albert Christian Edward, which I remembered as Ace, but in the moment of truth I stammered over Christian. We plighted our troths and exchanged our rings, and the congregation burst into God Save the Queen. In a trice I had become Princess Andrew and the Duchess of York. While we signed the marriage books, I replaced the flowers that had anchored my veil with a diamond tiara for my return trip down the aisle. It was my time to be Cinderella. I had stepped up as the country girl. I would walk back as a princess. But titles and diamonds counted for little against the man whose arm I took as we strode through that elegant wedding crowd. I was so intensely proud. Not that I was now a royal, but because I had married Andrew, and he was such a wonderful man. I married my man, and then I got my prince. I was so deeply attached, so profoundly in love. I didn't realize that, in getting my prince, I would have to give up so much, not least the man himself. It was the first night of our honeymoon when it fully dawned on me that ours would never be a normal marriage, that to marry a prince was to wed an institution. We were having dinner on Her Majesty's yacht Britannia. Serenading us from below was the Royal Marines Band, complete to the last tuba. 24 men marching up and down and playing that dreamy swing-era number, Pennsylvania 65000. And then, for a romantic change of pace, Chattanooga choo-choo, won't you come and choo-choo me home? There is the unusual, And then there is the surreal. The Britannia is a 5,700-ton craft. It takes 276 people to run and maintain it. On its main deck, you could land a small plane. And the passenger list for this 5-day jaunt around the Azores consisted of precisely two, the Duke and Duchess of York. That first dinner was our most intimate. From then on, Andrew invited the ship's officers to join us. That is what the Queen did. That is what he thought was expected. I longed to tell him that he didn't need to do it, that he could just be with me. After 5 days off the Portuguese coast, the Britannia swung north to pick up my new in-laws for their annual excursion to Balmoral. If I'd been scouting for signs of coming trouble, I might have noted that we'd been booked to spend 3 times as long with Andrew's family as we'd been on our own. But it wasn't a time to be rocking the boat, especially one as grand as this. Far easier and more pleasant to go with the flow, no questions asked. The honeymoon absolutely ended just a few days after we came back from Balmoral to Buckingham Palace. To that point, Andrew and I had spent only 1 night apart since our engagement. To that point, I had enjoyed a perfect fairy tale existence. But now the prince was leaving, and the princess would revert to a toad. Having completed his naval training course at Greenwich, Andrew received his new assignment, a weapons instructor course at Yeovilton, Somerset, 150 miles from London. In theory, I had understood that Royal Navy officers weren't homebodies, that Andrew would often be gone. In our engagement day interview on BBC, when asked how I would cope with becoming a Royal Duchess and a naval wife at the same time, I was typically nonchalant. "I'm going to enjoy it immensely," I said, adding that I had very strongly advised Andrew to continue his Navy career. It isn't hard to reconstruct my internal monologue from that time. "Don't worry about my feelings. I'm all right, Jack. Dad's is waltzing on air because I've got him the perfect son-in-law. Mum's thrilled to see me living out her fondest fantasies. Everyone's happy that I've done so well. Could I manage? How could I fail? How could I dare fail?" But while I knew Andrew would be leaving, I'd never really thought it through. It was abstract and dreary, like a dental appointment 6 months off. And what point could there be in dwelling on it? It was easier to pretend that life would go on as it had while Andrew worked in Greenwich. So it happened that Navy widowhood crashed down on me. 5 days out and 2 days back, a scenario that has killed many a marriage. For me it was worse than for most Navy wives, as my officer was also a prince. On weekends the naval officer became the Duke of York again, and I'd join him on some grey engagement in the hinterland. There was always something. Worst of all were his tours overseas, which could steal him for months at a stretch. I would see him off at the gangplank, wave bravely and smile, then limp back to the palace and nurse my wounds. I was 26 years old, and I would sit in my dressing room with those stately oils of Queen Victoria staring down at me, and I would break. I would cry softly, resignedly. There were no hysterics. I would just cry my quiet rivers. Through all our time of living together, Andrew was home for an average of 42 days per year. His absences gradually destroyed me. I was a romantic, sensual newlywed who loved her man. He was mine, and I was so happy. And when he left, I lost not just my lover, but also my mentor and staunchest ally on the crucial matter of being royal. I had no one to say yes or no, and I was terrified unto paranoia of my next gaffe. The simplest decisions unhinged me. Should I leave the dining room door open? Or was I meant to go downstairs and visit the Queen? I had to learn, I had to get it right. What was a princess meant to do? Modern royalty is expected to sing for its supper, earn its keep. Each day, at the back of the Times and the Daily Telegraph, they post the court circular, a listing of the prior day's engagements for each member of the royal family. It turns into a competition, a numbers game. The press keeps a running tabulation and is all too gleeful to point out when someone lags in the standings. But I had no need of outside prodding. As in every other job I'd held, I was driven by my own compulsion to excel and thereby ensure my acceptance, to be the best Duchess of York I could possibly be. Royal work has three components: official engagements, charity projects, and high ceremonies like Remembrance Day or Trooping the Colour. Andrew and I were scheduled at least 6 months in advance, based on joint household meetings in December and June, when our top staff people would excavate through mounds of invitations and recommend the ones they thought best. I now shared Andrew's private secretary, who coordinated our public lives, and his equerry, the number 2 man, an officer on secondment from the military. But I worked most directly with my lady-in-waiting, my personal secretary, my dresser, and a lady clerk or 2. Also at my service were 2 protection officers, the household valet, my chauffeur, and various palace butlers and footmen. I'd always done for myself, and having a staff took getting used to. But I did get used to it. Besides, it soon grew clear that I would require every one of my staff people, that the demands before me were insatiable, and I would really need all the help I could get. My day normally began at 6 o'clock. I was met by my dresser, who had already extracted the outfit for my first appointment, no simple job. Thanks to a monthly clothing allowance from the Queen, and a steady parade of representatives from the most au courant shops presenting their fashions for my approval, I would ultimately amass 15 fluffy formal ball gowns for state affairs and top-tier dinners, another 25 long dresses for slightly less formal occasions, 40 cocktail dresses, 150 day suits, 60 hats, and 200 pairs of shoes. With numbers on this scale, you couldn't just reach into a closet and pull out what you fancied. My wardrobe had its own file of 17 folders, with hundreds of colour sketches of my dresses and suits. Alongside each sketch, my dresser would jot down the name of the designer, the name and date of the function where I had last worn the item, the colour of the hat and shoes and gloves we'd matched with it. It could take up to an hour to change my clothes until I got the knack of it, and I would change 2 to 4 times a day. It played hob with my nerves, made me chronically almost late, but I took it as part of the course. Trot on, old girl. By 7 I was out of the door, a bit of fruit in my hand to eat on the fly, then back before lunch for another change, a look at the mail, and a consultation with Helen Spooner, my lady-in-waiting. Helen had a desk at our palace office, but it sat a quarter mile from the flat, and we often worked side by side in the dining room instead. Staff relations for this Duchess have always been most informal. I rely on my people's loyalty and friendship, and we've been known to share a glass of wine at work's end. But there were still the demands of protocol. Like everyone else, Helen greeted me with a curtsy. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness." She would thereafter address me as ma'am, until leaving for the day. Then she would curtsy again, and wish Her Royal Highness a good night. I found these rituals less bearable with old friends. "Don't do that. You don't have to do that," I would plead as they curtsied. "I'm still just Fergie." It took me a year to feel right about saying, "It's the Duchess of York" on the telephone. Whenever my protocol wavered, as it often did those first months, the Queen's lady-in-waiting took me aside to remind me of what was expected. Lunch was often geared to a meeting in the dining room, then back to the dressing room for another change, and the hairdresser and new makeup and a briefing by Helen on my next appointment. For formal London engagements or smart dinners, we would order a Rolls-Royce. These official cars were all more or less the same, all black with some age on them. On our way, Helen and I would go over her foolscap notes, reduced to the size of index cards. They included my agenda, any relevant correspondence, the key people I would be meeting. Even minor changes of schedule were fraught with complications. To move my hair appointment from 10 o'clock to 11 would affect the driver collecting the hairdresser, the footman who must be downstairs to escort her, and my dresser. I had no flexibility except in dates with friends, which I cancelled right and left until they'd grow vexed with me. I would keep to my schedule, come what may. I would be on time, dressed like a model duchess, getting each name right. I might feel like a weak old posy inside, drooping and wilted and nearly dead, but I would plant the most genuine smile on my face, and it would not fade. After my full day's round of events, more often than not, I'd have an evening function, another change of clothes, another hairdresser, another briefing. I would be hard-pressed to finish my change in 90 minutes, especially on occasions when I had to wear a tiara. Tiaras are heavier than they look and tend to slip when one takes leave of a carriage or car. The grips must be secured so that the tiara stays absolutely centered in line with the wearer's nose. As the slightest imprecision would make for a lethal photo opportunity, my hairdresser would readjust the finicky thing a dozen times. With Andrew away, I would also carry the ball at state dinners, not known for their brevity, and it could be midnight or later before I'd get back to the apartment. But still I was not done. There could be dozens of thank-you notes for our hosts of the day, not just the officials, but the young girl who had given me flowers, impromptu, or some valiant patient in his final fight. Not for me to simply sign a letter written by my staff. I would do my own, by hand, to the last thoughtful comma, as if the public would somehow know this and love me more for it. I'd fall into bed with nothing left, into sleep with no twilight. Then I would begin all over again the next morning. Consumed by hyperactivity, I never stopped to take a breath. I must have wanted it that way, to keep myself from peering at the lonely person within, the one I doubted and despised, because a moving target is tougher to strike, because I feared consciousness most of all. But the damnable thing about a treadmill is that it never gets you anywhere. The more you do, the greater the expectations. The more you do, the more there is left to be done. Have we sent the flowers to Lady Pinkerton just to make her happy? Have we thanked Lord Bloat for his deadly pompous introduction? Am I keeping up with the quota? Oh no, where is Andrew? Would he think this is right? Is it right? What was I supposed to do? And meanwhile, my spirit was slowly seeping away, like the air from a balloon you're huffing into with all your lungs. But it's been pricked by just the tiniest pin, and you know that the prick will prove mortal. I somehow hung in as the flavour of the month through the first year of my marriage and then some. As it had with Diana, the firm was counting on me to revitalise a somewhat dog-eared monarchy, to invigorate not only its bloodlines, but also its popularity among the taxpayers. I had the golden touch, it seemed. I would have a crack at everything. I was Wonder Woman, and what couldn't I conquer if I tried? My nerviest endeavour came after a reporter flippantly asked if I'd planned to follow Andrew and take up flying, and I thoughtlessly shot back, "Of course I'll learn to fly a helicopter." It was a ridiculous sweeping statement to make in front of all the press, but once I'd made it, I had to be a woman of my word. Besides, I wanted desperately to please my dear, distant, beloved husband, to show my interest in the Royal Navy, to share Andrew's life and his dinner conversation. I wanted to bowl him over 50-fold with pleasure. It was not every woman who could become a pilot, after all, or even who would try. I had no idea of how hard it would be. Before taking on the helicopter, I learned to operate a fixed-wing craft. I cut my teeth on a Piper Warrior, and straight away I saw the difference between cars and planes. You can stop the car any time and get out, but you have got to land the plane. Then I advanced to helicopters, which are more complicated and more dangerous. To hover one is like sitting on a golf ball, not that I've ever tried. A tiny movement either way can cause the machine to dip or lunge wildly. As I slowly gained proficiency, I felt new pride in my naval pilot husband, in how strong and brave he must be. By the time I received my helicopter license in November 1987, I had won more than mere applause. I had started off doing it for Andrew, to cement my acceptance in the family, but flying had grown into its own reward. Here I was, a person who had always struggled with her math, and I'd gone out and achieved this great discipline, though in darker moments I wondered, daft woman that I was, if they'd given me the license just because of my title. There was freedom in a helicopter, and release, and total privacy. In that cockpit, I felt, as I had in full gallop back in Dummer, that no one could catch me, and so I must be safe. Since my engagement was announced, I'd lived in Andrew's old bachelor quarters in the east wing of Buckingham Palace. I just moved in with him, though that was hardly the done thing. It was never an issue, which makes me think about how the palace was run, that it could bend and ignore things when it cared to. After the wedding, when Andrew took up his naval duties, I remained in the flat, too overwhelmed to dare make any other arrangements. The flat consisted of 5 rooms and 2 baths in a line, with interconnecting doors. A spacious railway flat, but hardly grandiose. The rooms were done with Victorian density, much the same as when Andrew had lived there alone and Charles before him. Damask curtains, pleated lampshades, bland carpeting, brownish wallpaper. The colour scheme exception was my dressing room, on one end, which Diana redid in pink and white when she briefly lived there. Of ordinary size, it was crammed with massive oak and rosewood wardrobes, a dressing table, and a large canopied bed. Next in line came the dining room, where we'd entertain guests at the long mahogany table or work at our separate desks. But when Andrew and I dined alone, we would move next door to the sitting room and set up at a small serving table by the television. Finally, there was our bedroom and Andrew's dressing room, an absolute time warp. Dozens of stuffed animals blanketed the bed, while pink teddies hugged each other atop a lamp. Boys' guns and bachelor bits lay all over, and I accepted it all as it was. I didn't mind the weighty furniture, or the museum-piece clocks from the royal collection, or the sad electric fireplaces. I saw the apartment as a transitional perch before the proper home we would get for ourselves. I added my bits and photographs, but they were buried amid the clocks and paintings and furniture that were here before we were born, and would stay there long after we'd departed. We were living above the shop, as my father-in-law, the Duke of Edinburgh, once put it, and could not easily forget it. The housemaids would come in and clean the heirloom silver and put everything back in exactly the right place. This palace was built for an empire, and if you looked around our rooms at the 19th century battle paintings or the leopard skins sprawled by the false fireplace, you might think we'd never lost India. The east wing of the palace served as headquarters for the Department of the Environment. The good bureaucrats arrived at 9:30 a.m. and left at 6 o'clock sharp. At any time in between, they might be strolling down the corridor, along with the footman, the mailman, the royal plumber, and that nice fellow who repaired the telephones. When your dining room is your office, and its door is often open, there is no stepping out of the bedroom half-dressed, unless you want to make new friends. Heat was rationed according to the Department of Environment standards. In the spring, the radiators went off, no matter if the streets stayed glazed with ice. You did not argue, you just found a second sweater. In September the steam came on again, Indian summer notwithstanding, which would not have been so bad, except that our old sash windows would open 6 inches, but no further. The windows were mostly off-limits, anyway. As one of London's leading tourist attractions, Buckingham Palace must stay postcard perfect at all times. As our apartment faced out on the Queen Victoria Memorial, nicknamed the Wedding Cake, we were barred from drawing the curtains all the way back, or from ever disturbing the shears. As a result, the sunlight, or as much as we got of it from our north-eastern exposure, would always be filtered and muted. Our chandeliers and standing lamps contained mainly 40-watt bulbs, a prudent economy, no doubt, but a bit squinty for desk work in the computer area. On an overcast day, it would get so dark in our sitting room that Jane Ambler, my personal secretary, would remove those pleated shades just to cheer me up. Jane is from Liverpool and shoots straight from the shoulder. As befitting the former cave of 2 bachelor boys, our flat had no kitchen. Meals had to be ordered the night before from the palace kitchen, which was a mile away. By the time the meal arrived, the footman would be weary and my grilled fish cold. Then the chef would finish for the night. My sister Jane once suggested that I longed to be able to do something ordinary, like just eat out of a saucepan. In fact, I would have been gratified to assemble a cheddar cheese sandwich or spoon into a raspberry yogurt. I would tell myself how lucky I was to be in the Queen's house, to have service at all. I must accept things the way they are done. But alone with Jane Ambler, my tears would well up and I'd soften my stiff upper lip. The real Sarah would peek out. She was an abjectly miserable soul. My true self would say, I don't want this. I just don't understand. Later, after Jane had finally gone home, I would ring her up and ask, what exactly are you doing now? At first she would laugh, but then she learned to go along with me. She might be putting the dishes in the dishwasher or ironing a shirt, and I would think, You are living a real life. This is real. For months I simply lived with the situation. It was, after all, the way things were done. Then, early in 1988, something happened to shake me into action, make me buck the status quo. I was going to have a baby, and where would we nest? That spring I went to everyone and said, "You've got to find me a house." But with Andrew at sea, there was no one to take charge of it, and I began to get despondent at the notion of raising my baby in the Department of the Environment building. Then I got lucky. At polo one day I sat next to Queen Noor, the American-born wife of King Hussein of Jordan, and I asked her if she knew of any cottage we might live in. She took me straight away to see an amazing place called Castlewood House, on the outskirts of Windsor Great Park in Berkshire. King Hussein had bought it for his children when they grew up, but Queen Noor said we could live there for a while. Castlewood had a swimming pool and a tennis court, and lush grounds at the edge of the park. It was my dream house. In May I moved in. Though duty bound me to the palace during the week, my weekends in the country were liberation. I had my own garden to walk in, a fridge to raid whenever I felt like it, my own kettle of all things. I had everything I needed in that big house, except for my man, now the watch-keeping officer on HMS Edinburgh. Andrew remained at sea for my entire pregnancy. On our second anniversary, he wrote to me from Singapore. In August, Andrew came home on 2 weeks' leave, and our baby was induced on the 8th to fit the Royal Navy's schedule. I had never warmed to babies much. I liked children when they were old enough to answer back. But that was before I had my own. When I looked into my daughter's sweet face and huge eyes, I felt such overwhelming pride. We named her Beatrice after Queen Victoria's youngest daughter. 4 days later, my newborn and I were flown straight to Scotland. Andrew wanted a week to get us settled at Balmoral before he went back to sea. Time for another signal. As I walked out of the hospital, holding my baby, I skidded and ripped my stitches. It was too much, too soon, too fast. The three of us might have had a blissful week alone together at Castlewood instead, but August in Balmoral was sacrosanct. It was what Andrew wanted, and that's what we did. It would make him happy, and if he were happy, life would be easier, or so I thought. In fact, life was dismal. We stayed in a lodge on the estate, and I cried every day when Andrew was with me, for I knew he would be leaving with the Lark. And then he was gone, back to his ship in the Philippines. And I moved into the castle after he left, feeling fat and self-conscious, and altogether quite hideous. I holed up in my room, writing 750 thank you notes by hand for the baby presents. At last we got back to London, and I saw how my world had changed irrevocably, and for the better. Our dining room office at the palace was now a nursery as well. I would bobsled through my engagements as before, but I'd feel a new thrill as day's end approached, to come home to Beatrice, this tiny thing I could play with and be with, responding to her every need. It was a precious time, and my sole regret is that I failed to seize more of it. While pregnant, I had fallen behind in the royal duties race, and felt pressured to catch up, to make my quota and not look too shabby in the year-end totals. What the hell was I doing? Here was my most remarkable achievement, this beautiful girl I had given Andrew, and yet I could not pause to enjoy her. The pleaser was working overtime, and still she was cheating the two who mattered most, the new mother and her child. In September, when Beatrice was 6 weeks old, I left her with her nanny to join Andrew on tour in Australia. I had urgently wanted to take her with me. Newborns are highly portable after all. You simply strap them to your chest, and off you went. They were happy with a smile and a coo now and then, and a bottle and a clean nappy. But the firm was quite firm on this point. It would be ill-advised to take Beatrice to Australia, the courtiers informed me. You can't flit halfway around the world with a baby. And the last thing in the world the poor child wants is to be dragged from place to place. And for me, the clincher, it's simply not done. Here, then, was my dilemma. Should I leave my child or my husband? I was getting trim at last, and I wanted Andrew to look at me as a woman again. Only later would I realize that he cared far less about my weight than I did. I could not bear the image of him turning up at port without me standing there, and waiting with the other officers' wives. Most of all, I needed to shore up my marriage. The 2 years since our wedding had wafted us apart, though I didn't dare say as much. I sensed we were in trouble. It had to be Andrew's turn now. I knew Beatrice would be well cared for by Alison, and so I left. If I had to do it over, I would have snatched my baby up and made a run for it. Instead, I bowed to my fear of whispers. What would the courtiers say about me? What would the family think? Look at her. She doesn't listen, she doesn't take advice, and so on. The trip to Australia wound up pleasing no one. Each morning I awoke with the ache of missing a part of myself. Andrew was caught up in his job and the Navy Boys Club, and 6 weeks cannot save a marriage in any case. The press, meanwhile, laid the most hurtful charge imaginable, that I was a bad mother. No one cared to remember that the Queen and the Queen Mother before her had once been obliged to leave their own infants and go out on tour. The tabloids can nod to history or leave it, depending on their aim, and now they aimed to do me in. I had gotten a few knocks before, but this attack was something different. It was heavy and enduring and mean-spirited, and soon it would spiral into something much worse. Fergie Mania was dead and buried. It was my time to be the royal scapegoat. As with everything else, I would do it in a big way. Where exactly did my plummet begin? Many months before Australia, I'd begun to feel that some great, massive machine was pulling me down. It was set on automatic, and it never let up. At the palace, I felt perplexed, helpless. Not just now and then, but 8 times a day. I could not ring up Andrew and say, "How do I deal with this?" With each mistake, I lost confidence, and the more I lacked confidence, the more silly things I did, till I dove into a tailspin with the joystick sawn off in my hand. In short, I was a sitting duck for the first tabloid in need of a potshot. When I first joined the cast, the Princess of Wales happened to be out of favour. By late 1987, however, Diana had been restored to Golden Girl status. Her return opened a vacancy on Fleet Street for the Bad Royal, a role filled at one time or another by Philip, Margaret, Charles, Anne, and Princess Michael. And who better to play the heavy than an overweight ex-commoner with a strong, now overbearing personality, and a candid, now tactless way of talk? The Duchess of York was declared a loser, a major, big-time loser. And unlike Charles or Anne, who were royals by birth, she was also expendable. No need to worry about going too far with her. I was bruised when the press chastised my behaviour. I was blooded when they condemned my taste in clothes. But what hurt most by far was when they wrote I was fat, the hobgoblin I'd fought since puberty. Of all the headlines composed in my honour, there is one that takes first prize. Set above a singularly unflattering photograph, it proclaimed me Duchess of Pork. As awful and humiliating as these articles could be, the worst part, the most defeating part, was that all of them were smokescreens. I could have looked like Michelle Pfeiffer, dressed like Jackie Onassis, and behaved like Mother Teresa, and at the end of the day, it would have made no difference. It would have forced the editors to work a little harder, to use more of their fertile imagination. But they are resourceful people. They would have found a way. Viewed objectively, I was a sadder and lonelier person in 1988 than in 1986, but not a demonstrably different one. The main change lay not within myself, but in how I was perceived. The remarkable Fergie was a welcome dose of new blood, the wholesome product of solid country stock, whose parents were well accepted by the royal family. The fat and appalling Fergie was a coarse and common girl from Basingstoke, the daughter of a royal retainer and a woman who'd run off with some Spanish-speaking foreigner. The remarkable Fergie was unpretentious, straightforward, good-humoured and exuberant. The fat and appalling Fergie was crass, rude, raucous and bereft of all dignity. The deck stacked against me. I was damned not for what I did or how I looked, but for whom I was, and that was something I was helpless to change. Despite all I have been through with London's tabloids, I would not shoot the messenger. I know how a reporter's fair account can be twisted to match a good headline. how basically honest editors can be pushed by competitive pressure into stories built on sand. Most editors are pragmatists, with no particular axe to grind. In my case, they made a simple judgment call. They decided that their long-term interest lay in playing ball with the system rather than with me. They assumed that the palace machinery would grind me down, that I would surrender and then I would leave. But the press made two mistakes. On the first count, I did leave, but I have yet to surrender. On the second count, they missed a tremendous story, something much bigger than any brickbat thrown my way, even bigger, if you can imagine, than two consenting adults showing affection by a swimming pool. In my opinion, the press is still missing that story today. As yet unwritten is the tale of how some of the most trusted people at Buckingham Palace have undermined the monarchy itself. The Prince of Wales once put it neatly. "We don't run our staff," Charles said, "they run us." If the royal family represented the firm's board of directors, with the Queen as chairman of the board, the senior courtiers were the operating officers, the ones who called the shots from day to day. At the top of their pyramid loomed the private secretaries, one for each branch of the family. They ruled their fiefdoms with the assistance of their deputies and equerries. Think of bureaucrats with epaulets. And they ruled with an iron hand. These were the grey men, the obsequious band that shaped palace policy and decided who gets access to the royals themselves. Essentially, they were well-marinated Sloane Rangers. Their suits were charcoal or navy, perhaps with a pinstripe, striped or coloured shirts, pale pink or pale blue, old-school ties, black shoes buffed to within an inch of their lives. Mr. Z was the firm's CEO. Were you to happen upon him outside the palace, you might think Mr. Z a superb bowler hat caricature of the upper-class Englishman. Discreetly modulated, professionally adenoidal, Mr. Z could be most polite and charming when he cared to. By his own lights, I believe, he was an honest man who did his job as he saw fit. But that job, as we shall see, was not for the faint-hearted. Mr. Z was the firm's enforcer, its soft-spoken muscle, upholder of standards and guardian of the rules. And though the rules might seem arbitrary, and at some removed from real life, any sorry transgressor would find a different side to that man with the glistening hair, abrupt, scathing, pitiless. This courtier's courtier spoke with the Queen's voice, and he had the Queen's ear. By the time our paths crossed, he seemed to have lost sight of where the sovereign's interests ended and his own began. He must have presumed they were one and the same. In theory, the firm's purpose was to advise and organize members of the royal family, to translate their wishes into action, to temper their excesses, and thereby spare them embarrassment. In practice, the firm's job was to perpetuate their own power. More royal than the royals, the courtiers ran the snootiest club in Britain. Their hostility toward outsiders was legend. In Victoria's day, they referred to Prince Albert as that German, and his aides as German spies. More recently, Prince Philip took a try at reorganizing palace management and ran smack into a wall. For what good was it to be exclusive if you could not keep others out? And what was the point of a sinecure if one was now to be judged on merit? The firm and I were natural adversaries. They drove me mad, these constipated, self-appointed keepers of the gate. In their view, I was hopelessly erratic, due to some women's problem, no doubt. I wasn't cut from the right cloth. I had this misguided fetish to be real. I was, as one newspaper noted, bringing too much daylight into the magic of the monarchy. As Count Dracula, the grand aristocrat of bloodsuckers, could attest, daylight is no good for parasites. For the undead, it is lethal, much like fresh air. There could be no truce between us. I was getting judged all day long, and I don't take well to judging. It brings out the mischievous child in me, makes me wilder and more headstrong. The courtiers could still wound me. Did they talk about me at lunch today? But they could not move me. I would always be different. I would never fit in. Though tethered by circumstance, the grey men and I increasingly went our separate ways. Cut off from the traditional palace network of advice and support, I would soon seek my sustenance from other, less official quarters. And less than 3 years into my marriage, as the monarchy teetered in a new and uncertain time, the firm would have its scapegoat, its maiden for the pyre. Always considerate, she had brought her own matches and kindling. She would be cooked to order, and the field would be the world's favourite subject, money, and how I was spending rather more than I had. My parents did not raise me to love material things, but I did inherit, from Mum, in particular, an enjoyment of the good life. It was important to have wonderful holidays and good food and parties done right. I never learned to pinch my pennies, even when my pockets were light. By the time I met Andrew, I could juggle debts with the best of them. I came into Buckingham Palace with a bank overdraft of $800, a serious sum when you are making $18,000 a year and your sole asset is a 10-year-old car. At that point, you might have assumed that my financial worries were over, that I would live solvently ever after in the bosom of one of the richest families in the world. The reality was something else, for I had married the second son, and that made all the difference. While Andrew received a moderate sum from the civil list, it went for the cost of official engagements and for staff and office expenses. As for my husband's personal income, the Royal Navy might provide free room and board and a chance to see the world, but it was no place to make one's fortune. In all our years together, Andrew's income never exceeded $50,000, not that he cared. He didn't carry cash, anyway, and had written few checks in his life. Ever since he was born, he had everything done for him. But now he had a family, and finances got more complicated. We received a small allowance to cover expenses at Castlewood, but not enough for upkeep and staff. And while my clothing stipend from the Queen was kind and generous, I struggled to make do. In the rarefied strata I was now obliged to move through, where a single evening dress could easily run $4,000 and up, my allowance was soon depleted. But I did possess one magical instrument, an account at Coutts, the royal family's bank, with apparently unlimited credit. I used that credit line liberally, lavishly, totally over the top. Where did the money go? Quite a bit to cover costs at Castlewood and later at Sunninghill Park, the new home we'd moved into in 1990. A fair amount for trips, to be sure, and even more after my daughters came along, for I would take them almost everywhere. I refused to stop doing what I had done all my life, no matter how the press reviled me for my foreign vacations. Not least, I spent money shopping. I was the impulse buyer incarnate. I had always been a great one for giving. Now, with Coutts behind me, I played Santa all year long. It was easy and convenient to do. Merchants were more than happy to bring their wares into the palace for approval, and I did not see my generosity as a fault. In my defence, I was not entirely insensible to my growing pool of red ink. I tried to save money where I could. I found that some designers would allow me a deep discount in return for the publicity value of my wearing their fashions. It seemed like a no-lose deal to me, a business that served both sides and hurt no one. Wrong again. I found out that such things were not done by a royal duchess. The tabloids created a new cartoon strip, Freebie Fergie, alias Fergie the Freeloader. What they failed to understand, in the press and in the palace, was that I urgently wanted to work, to earn, to be productive. I missed a real job stimulation and rested uneasy in depending upon the royal family. A sound presentiment there. The idea for my first children's book was born at 5,000 feet. By late in 1987, I had grown bored with my helicopter lessons, and so I turned them into a childish adventure playground. I started calling my helicopter Budgie, after the bird I thought it resembled. Before long, I had infused Budgie with a full-fledged personality, just as I had with my childhood ponies and dogs. He was a freckled, impulsive, slightly dishevelled boy, the type who goes out with his cap on wrong and oil spilling out of his tummy. Much later, my debt blooming by the day, I went to a prominent polo friend of Dad's. I outlined my financial straits, and then I started talking about Budgie. "This is a really good idea," the man said. He put me in contact with Morton Janklow, the New York literary agent, who in turn got me a contract with Simon & Schuster. Soon I was scribbling out plot lines in pencil on our mahogany table at Castlewood. I gave Budgie a Piper Warrior friend named Pippa. The settings were inspired by my own fixed-wing flights over the rugged Devon coast. In October 1989, my first two books, Budgie the Little Helicopter and Budgie at Bendix Point, came out. It was a huge, proud moment for me, but the backlash had begun before the books reached the stores. From the start, I had pledged a portion of the Budgie proceeds to charity, but the press deemed that insufficient, especially after they had wildly inflated the amounts going into my pocket. Over the 7 years since Budgie first appeared, I have received barely $500,000 in total from the books and the animated cartoon spin-offs. Much of that has been given away. I had blasphemed the Burke's peerage creed, that it was perfectly dignified to inherit one's own money and never do a lick of real work, but unseemly for a royal to soil her hands in the common swamp of commercialism. Here was perfect Wonderland logic. On the one hand, I was not given enough money to pay our bills. On the other, I was told I could not earn my own. An exquisite catch-22, not the first or the last I would encounter, but one with especially nasty repercussions. Whenever friends of mine get engaged, I am full of sage advice. Spend all the time you can with your husband or wife, I tell them. Never go away for long, and keep a healthy distance from your families to establish a real family of your own. As the voice of hard experience, I know the importance of laying a strong foundation in the first years of marriage. When the winds come, and believe me, they will come, you will need that foundation for your house to stand firm. Andrew and I were home together roughly 1 day out of 10. Through the whole of our marriage, discounting our Royal Marines Band honeymoon, we spent exactly 5 days alone on holiday in Barbados. That was a joy, but not nearly enough. My husband grasped the problem as well as I. I am a prince, then a naval officer, then a husband, he would say. Those were the priorities put upon him, and one of the three had to lose. I just can't cope with the separations, I told the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh. It was early in 1987 when Andrew was stationed at Portland. We were approaching his parents with a modest proposal. Couldn't I go and live in normal naval quarters like a normal naval wife? I knew I could adapt to any situation, so long as my man was near. Much frowning in response. It wasn't possible, they told us. The security for one thing, it just wasn't done. But it's really very difficult not being with him, I said. Well, Prince Philip replied, the Mountbatten's managed and so can you. Stiffen that lip, old girl. The subject was closed. Looking back, I should have persisted. For that matter, I should have asked Andrew to leave the Navy. There were certainly other royal roles he could have filled. He might have got angry with me, but we might still be together today. Of course, I should have fought for myself, for our marriage, for what I believed was right. But I was frightened of my shadow then. I thought that a good wife sat and made the best of things. That to marry a man, much less a prince, meant accepting what he did. I didn't know how to fight that way, and Andrew, who could never forget that his mother was also his queen, was no more able than I. Sometime in the winter of 1989-1990, a friend asked me to receive Dr. Ramzi Salman, who was head of marketing for the Iraqi state oil interests. It would be a palace courtesy call, a friendly drink and no more. 3 years in the system had taught me to take precautions. I asked a senior courtier to double-check that it was all right and to make the arrangements. The courtier came back and said everything was fine, but that it might be nicer to meet in the white drawing room rather than in our dining room. When you are spinning on your own merry-go-round, as I was, it is hard to see what is going on around you. 6 months or more before the invasion of Kuwait, I did not realize that Saddam Hussein was already deemed a threat by the West. I was just doing a favor for a friend who had been good to me. And though I had asked for advice, nearly begged for it, no one in the firm chose to brief me that I was tramping through a diplomatic minefield. The courtier instructed Dr. Salman to come through the sovereign's entrance, which I assumed was appropriate for any visiting official. We met in the white drawing room, had a drink and a chat. Our conversation was too innocuous to remember. The senior courtier was with us every minute and looked appropriately bored. There was not the faintest signal that I might have jeopardized the Queen's close ties with the Emir of Kuwait, who would soon be living in exile in London. But that is just what I had done. And worse, I had rubbed everyone's noses in it. Had I met with Dr. Salmon in my flat, as originally planned, and had he come through a lesser entrance, our meeting might have been less conspicuous. But I hadn't, and he hadn't. My self-sabotage had taken another great step forward. I did not know it at the time, but that casual drink in the white drawing-room might have sealed my fate. On Friday, March the 9th, 1990, I took a call at the apartment. It was Mr. Z. He wanted to see me in his office at 11 o'clock. I panicked. I've been called in to see the headmaster. What have I done? Oh my gosh, I'm going to get told off. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. I was 8.5 months pregnant. Mr. Z's office lay half a mile away, and it took me some time to traverse the red runway of a corridor. I got there promptly at 11 and was ushered into an office with 3 hard faces: Mr. Z, Mr. Y, his deputy, and a third courtier in reserve. Without further ado, they piled on. They had been looking forward to this seminar for some time, I believe. "We don't like your behaviour," Mr. Z began, drawing himself up into the royal first-person plural. When I asked for an example, they were off to the races. They had a laundry list of violations, and all 3 men were well rehearsed. Their barrage lasted a full hour, and it was brutal to the end. With hindsight, the courtiers must have regarded me as a lame duck, dead in the water, or they would not have dared speak to me that way. For the most part, I just bore their harangue, too numb for tears. But as I staggered out of the door, I managed to ask, "Does Her Majesty know that you are telling me this?" One of the courtiers nodded. "We have Her Majesty's full authority to tell you this." I cannot remember which one spoke. At that point, the 3 men were one hostile blur. Distraught, almost dizzy, I wobbled my way to the lift and back up to the 2nd floor. I started to hike the red runway, but it seemed that it stretched for miles. Never had I felt such turmoil. My hormones were up the spout anyway, and now I had been blasted by the monarch, by my beloved Mama. I felt like I wore the mark of Cain. It was my worst nightmare turned to flesh, the final absolute rejection. I was still a good 80 yards from the flat when I reeled and nearly fainted by a grand piano. That was where Jane Ambler found me. She somehow gathered me up and got me home to Castlewood, where I would lie in bed for 2 days. On Sunday, I finally got back on my feet and went to see the Queen at Windsor. I asked her why she had sent her 3 men to rebuke me. Why hadn't she voiced her concerns to my face? My story surprised the Queen. She had been unaware of my pummeling. A sad postscript appends this story. To that point, my pregnancy had been smooth and easy. The sonograms showed the baby to be well positioned. I'd assumed I would have a natural childbirth, as I had with Beatrice. But after her mother's going over that morning in the palace, my baby did something rare for a fully grown fetus. She turned herself around in the womb into a breech position. She had heard what the outside world was like, and quite sensibly wanted no part of it. Eugenie was delivered at 8 p.m. on Friday, March the 23rd by caesarean section. I still carry the scar, a memento from the grey men. By this time, I was feeling lost and alienated from all around me, and depicted in the press as some contemptible Looney Tune. But once or twice a week I met people who saw me for who I was, who knew that I wasn't such a bad person. These were all people afflicted with motor neuron disease, or MND, known in the US as Lou Gehrig's disease. I first became aware of motor neuron disease through my dear friend Sir Robert Cook. Sir Robert wrote the first book I ever assembled, titled The Palace of Westminster. He was an extraordinary author, immensely authoritative on the subject, as well as wonderfully eccentric and creative. It was shortly before my wedding that I suspected something was wrong. The 6 flights of stairs up to my Mayfair office seemed to be taking more out of my friend. He'd be winded, even stumbling by the time he reached my door. When I asked him what was wrong, he would smile and say, "Oh, got to get a bit fitter." Then he would turn the talk to our work. Over the next few weeks, there were more disquieting signs. Sir Robert's handwriting grew unsteady, his gait more wobbly. Eventually he asked me, "Would you mind if we met downstairs next time?" And so we did. And finally Sir Robert confided that he'd been diagnosed with MND. Motor neuron disease kills 3 people a day in Britain, more than AIDS. Yet I had never heard of it before. It cried out for more public awareness. Once it hit close to me, I became insatiable in learning all I could. I found out that MND can strike adults of any age, and that there is no cure or treatment. But we don't even know how it is triggered. Recent research has focused on environmental toxins, but findings remain inconclusive. What we do know from sad experience is how ruthlessly MND destroys the nerves that govern movement, how inexorably it wastes the muscles. Little by little, one is robbed of the ability to walk, to speak, to swallow, and finally, to breathe. The cruel irony is that MND spares the mind and senses. You are all too aware of your own decay. Your body becomes a prison, a private death row. With the quiet bravery I would come to see so often among people with this disease, Sir Robert never complained. On January 6, 1987, he dictated the final paragraphs of the Palace of Westminster into a tape recorder. His assignment completed, he died that same day, at the age of 56. Sir Robert's work remained impeccable to the last sentence. His brain had stayed as good as on the day he was born. When I asked Lady Cook what I might do for her, she requested nothing for herself. Instead, she made me an invitation. Would I be the royal patron for the Motor Neuron Disease Association? I had already linked up with more than a dozen charities. They were part and parcel of one's life within the royal family. But the Motor Neuron Disease Association was the first one that I would champion as my own. The more I learned about motor neuron disease, the more work there seemed to be done. As royal patron, my job was to raise both funds and awareness to fight this little-known killer. The Motor Neuron Disease Association spent more than $3 million a year and received less than $20,000 from the government. The money went toward bed elevators and motorized recliner chairs, loaned free of charge to individuals. A telephone helpline to answer people's questions and steer them to other services. A network of regional care advisors furnishing each family with an advocate, subsidies for respite care, and, not least, funding for drug trials and other medical research. The MND Association also gave me great inspiration. I won't soon forget the first time I met Stephen Hawking, the association's patient's patron and one of the great brains of our time. The professor was locked into his wheelchair, but he had not lost his sense of humour. After clasping my hand, he tapped for several seconds on his keyboard, and a voice synthesizer intoned, "Excuse my American accent." After one encountered a man like that, it was infuriating to see people with MND to be treated as though they were drunk or mentally deranged, as people to be avoided on the street. The disease can be crushingly isolating. Friends and relatives tend to be frightened or embarrassed. They don't know what to do with a person who can't talk, so they pull back. When I attended an MND conference, I would be struck by its brimming energy. The room would feel charged like the air before a thunderstorm. All of these silenced people would be packed together, and they'd be straining to push out so much feeling and information to me through their subconscious. I felt washed by a huge, great wave. Peter Cardy, the association's director, called it the fire. No matter how large the gathering, I would speak to each individual before I left. I refused to be rushed off. I'd be late to my next engagement if I had to be. These people were all so desperate to be understood, to leap the chasm of their speechlessness, and somehow I could read into them, and we would have this very intense one-way conversation. I wasn't satisfied to be another public face with a pitch. My friends needed more than a figurehead. Most of all, they needed a cure. A goal that could seem impossibly abstract as we awaited our first real breakthrough. In February 1990, I organised a meeting at Buckingham Palace of half a dozen leading researchers in the hope that their exchange might spark some new ideas. On my way there, I got a call from Mum. Hector had felt ill for months, and now they knew why. He had cancer of the lymph glands. he would be treated with chemotherapy at Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York. I shuttled to New York several times that spring. Between his treatments, Hector stayed at White Birch Farm, the Connecticut home of his best friend Peter Brandt. It was hard to see El Gordo so gaunt and listless. One day I organized a baseball game on the lawn with the security men, just to break the heavy mood. I think Hector enjoyed watching that. That summer, Mom called from Argentina. It was a matter of days now, she said, and Hector had asked to see me and Beatrice one more time, and to meet little Eugenie. I had to ask the Queen's permission to go. No member of the royal family had visited Argentina since the Falklands War, and only recently had Britain restored its ambassador. Her Majesty wished me Godspeed, and the three of us left for El Pucará on July the 28th. Hector rallied enough to be driven out to watch us ride his wonderful ponies, out past the cedar trees I'd helped plant a decade before. I held Beatrice, not quite 2, in front of my saddle, her first horse-riding lesson. 2 days after we left, Hector died at the age of 51. I went into total and utter head down. I didn't feel like I had lost a father, or a stepfather. I felt like I had lost a friend, my best friend. Castlewood was my nest, and I felt safe there, but I knew we couldn't stay forever. With 2 children in tow, it was time for Andrew and me to find a permanent abode. It would be a gift from the Queen, as per tradition. I would have loved to have had an older home. I was ready to live anywhere feasible. Unfortunately, all the houses nearby had been rented or sold. There was no empty royal residence nearer than Yorkshire. So we decided to build our own house, with the Queen's full support. We chose a site at Sunning Hill Park, close to Windsor Park and near a lake, and soon were caught up in layouts and room plans. Andrew and I made all the big decisions together, another layer of stress in my life, another escape hatch. The more I had to do, you see, the less I had to feel. As Sunning Hill Park neared completion, I got more excited, until one day we were pulled up short. The money people at the palace had signed off on the plans for Sunning Hill at every step, and now they shut the budget. The pool and tennis court were yet to be built. Luxuries, granted, but a big house must have its finishing touches if it's not to look half-baked. The garden was not done, and it wasn't just the grounds. There were cornices on the walls left incomplete. We had no funds for curtains. By the time the last worker left, I would draw more than $500,000 out of my own account to finish Sunning Hill. Some of it came from Budgie, but we needed quite a lot more. Plus, Hector had left Mum with considerable debt. She would be fighting to hold on to El Pucará, and I had to help her. We were all in a fix. We needed a financial infusion, and fast. The solution, the only one that presented itself, was a deal with Hello, a Spanish-based magazine that doted on fluffy photo spreads on royalty. In return for what they'd term a privileged glimpse behind the public image, Hello would pay us some $350,000. The photographs would be taken at Castlewood by a friend of Andrew's. When the magazine came out that August, I was flabbergasted. Rather than devoting its standard 5 or 6 pages to us, as I had assumed, our family was splashed across 75 candid photographs on 48 pages. It was much too much, like bringing an Iraqi minister through the sovereign's entrance. Taken one by one, the pictures were not very shocking. My family looked happy and loving and altogether normal, no different from anyone else. And that was our crime exactly. The Hello spread had pierced the central myth of royalty, that they are of some different species. Once more I had ignored the ramifications. I had leapt in where royals fear to tread. One of the most dangerous things perpetrated by members of the royal family, declared the ubiquitous Hal Brooks Baker. Author Barbara Cartland chanted the establishment's theme song with perfect pitch. She wrote, "We don't want the royals behaving like EastEnders. We might as well have pictures of the Queen Mother taking her clothes off and climbing into the bath. If the royal family lose their mystique, they will go altogether. The younger ones don't seem to understand this. It's all very well them wanting to be liked, but this is taking the common touch far too far." Andrew was off on his frigate when the magazine came out. I would have to talk to his mother, he said. He just couldn't deal with it. I screwed up my courage and joined the family on Her Majesty's yacht Britannia for 10 days of penance. 10 days of telling off by the firm for my execrable judgment and astounding impropriety. There was no question as to who would take the rap. Andrew was the sovereign's son and had to be protected. Never mind that it took two to tango, that my husband's grinning face shone out from hello next to mine. I was the greedy bewitcher, and he a mere dupe of a duke. A few months after my latest disgrace, BBC Television began taping an unprecedented documentary called Elizabeth R. It depicted a year in the life of Her Majesty. Along with footage of state visits and high ceremonies, the public would enjoy several more intimate vignettes behind the pageantry. The Queen inspecting a racehorse at Sandringham or rooting for her pick at Epsom Downs. The family joking about on the day of Eugenie's christening. The Queen taking Beatrice on a pony ride at Balmoral. No one shuddered or recoiled when this video was broadcast. No cry went up from Burke's Peerage or Barbara Cartland. A little daylight was not so terrible, it turned out, when the Queen was adjusting the blinds. I had known we'd take some criticism for Sunning Hill, but I was caught short by its ferocity. The tabloids delighted in calling it South York, after the grandiose South Fork in the TV show Dallas. One more time I bore the brunt of the onslaught, as though the place had been my idea alone. But that was not even the point. Sunning Hill was our dream and creation, our fair prerogative, and why should anyone have the right to pull it apart? Meanwhile, my debts kept rolling up like the digits on a petrol pump. A larger house meant more staff, a valet and a nanny, a cook and a butler, and the weekend staff as well. People would say I should roll up my sleeves and carry the weekend load myself, but I had other obligations. My royal quota, for one thing. In 1989, I had soared to near the top of the standings with 327 official engagements. In 1990, I dropped to last with only 108. 10 fewer, the tabloids noted, than the Queen Mother, who was 90 years old at the time. My apparent slump inspired a whole new raft of headlines. The laziest royal, the Duchess of Doolittle. I was a shameless Switzerland ski bum. Or a brain-fried Riviera sun-worshipper. Take your pick. No one seemed to notice that I'd been busy that year, in my own small way. I had given birth to a child, lost my stepfather, organised our move to Sunning Hill. Moreover, I was doing more Duchess work than advertised. I was charging along, in fact, at breakneck pace. By 1990, I was serving as president of 4 charities and patron for 12 others. There might be briefings 5 times a day. I was getting briefed as I prepared to deliver Eugenie. Much of my activity wasn't charted by the court circular. Private visits to the homes of motor neuron disease patients, or to Trinity Hospice in Clapham, visits to charity headquarters and dining room meetings at the Palace, telephone briefings, or the river of obligatory letters. I refused to be just a name on a letterhead. I was more hands-on than the traditional royal, and my numbers suffered for it. I always felt cheated of time with my daughters, felt permanently torn and guilty. It wrenched my heart when Beatrice asked her nanny, "Oh, why couldn't we go and live where Mummy lives sometimes?" Meaning the Palace, where I burrowed in for days at a time. I would hear the chorus in my head. "Maybe you are a bad mother after all. You cannot do anything right." Now Hector was gone, and I had this huge new house to maintain. The whole world seemed to be slipping away from me, and I could not find my grip. The events of Annus Horribilis were a long time germinating. In May of 1990, I had taken a brief holiday on the Moroccan coast with an American friend called Priscilla Phillips. We flew out on a private plane and stayed at a public resort called La Gazelle d'Or, where I paid the bill. The locale was idyllic. Our 5 days were uneventful and unobserved, or so I thought. I had no way of knowing that an anonymous tipster had called the London tabloid Today and reported that a mutual American friend, Steve Wyatt, was with me and Priscilla in Morocco. An absolute falsehood. After Steve left London in 1991, the danger of a frame-up seemed real enough to lead me to have his Belgravia flat searched, top to bottom. It was clean. Several weeks later, a window cleaner entered the flat to spruce it up for the next tenant. In the guest bedroom, he spotted several plastic packets on top of a shelving unit. Inside were more than 100 photographs. The pictures ultimately found their way to the Daily Mail. On January the 15th, 1992, the Mail ran this front-page headline, "Mystery of Fergie Photographs." Over that day and the next, the half-dozen major tabloids would devote a total of more than 40 pages to the story. The gist of the tale was that Steve had flown me to Morocco in his plane and had been there with us throughout. The whole invention was flimsy and ridiculous, a web of fabricated facts and harmless pictures. The photographs discovered in Belgravia were actually taken on 2 different occasions at 2 different places. It was no surprise to learn that they'd been developed on different dates. A mystery, indeed. New Scotland Yard was called in to investigate and came up with nothing. But one police source told the press the obvious, that the photographs might have been planted to embarrass me, as part of a conspiracy to tarnish her image and destroy her marriage. While the photographs were trifling of themselves, they set in motion much larger events. They were the head of the match to a cache of dry powder. For me, they were the proverbial last straw, hemmed in by innuendo, mocked by the press and harried by the courtiers, fettered to a schedule which never let me exhale. I had reached my limit. My brain felt like it was about to explode. On January 21, 6 days after the Belgravia photographs came out, I told Andrew at dinner that I thought we should separate. We were both very sad. It was the last thing we had wanted. But he saw my resignation and did not try to argue. "If this will make you happy, then I'll stand by you." The next morning we went up to see the Queen in Sandringham. I walked in gripping my rosary for strength. "I'm so sorry," I said, "but I think this is best for you and your family. I can't go on letting you down." The Queen looked sadder than I had ever seen her. She asked me to reconsider, to be strong and go forward. But I was resolute. With the general election coming up in April, I agreed to play down, to not rush into anything publicly. Just as my engagement had been deferred to suit affairs of state, so would my separation. Word got around, however. Within days of our trip to Sandringham, I was cut out of the court circular. Engagements were cancelled without notice or explanation. The flow of invitations from the Lord Lieutenants, the county's liaisons to the palace, trickled to a stop. There would be no more shopping centres to open, no more factories to visit. The firm was sending me a message in its own subtle way. Don't let the door hit you on your way out. On Wednesday, March 18th, 3 weeks before the general election, the dam burst. In a front-page exclusive, the Daily Mail reported that the palace is preparing to announce the separation of the Duke and Duchess of York. The story went on to disclose sketchy details of our lawyers' discussions. I was more shocked than anyone at the headlines. I had no advance word. I knew only one thing for sure, that no good could come of this. With the election reduced to a sideshow, the palace's hand was forced. On Thursday, March 19th, the 6th anniversary of our engagement, Mr. X, the Queen's press secretary, issued a brief press release. In view of the media speculation which the Queen finds especially undesirable during the election campaign, Her Majesty is issuing the following statement. Last week, lawyers acting for the Duchess of York initiated discussions about a formal separation for the Duke and Duchess. These discussions are not yet completed, and nothing will be said until they are. The Queen hopes that the media will spare the Duke and Duchess and their children any intrusion. Just after noon, a veteran BBC radio man named Paul Reynolds returned to Mr. X's office for a private chat. A bit of clarification. 20 minutes later, Reynolds emerged with the royal story of the year. He announced over BBC's World at One, "The knives are out for Fergie in the palace." Then came the bombshell allegation that I had hired a public relations company to leak the separation story to the Daily Mail. And there was more, Reynolds said. I have rarely heard palace officials speak in such terms about someone. They are talking about her unsuitability for public life, royal life, her behaviour in being photographed in Hello magazine. By the end of the day, the public relations company in question had categorically denied any involvement in the leak. Sir David English, the Mail's editor, backed them up. On Friday morning, Mr. X issued a rather mealy retraction. I very much regret that what was said should have been interpreted by the media to the detriment of the Duchess of York. He also distributed copies of the notes he had sent to the Queen and myself, including what he phrased as his personal apologies for the distress that this episode has caused you. The retraction, one columnist wrote, was like applying a tourniquet to someone's neck after they had been guillotined. Mr. X submitted his resignation, but the Queen rejected it. At the risk of seeming ungenerous, I would submit that Mr. X's tears were crocodilian. It was the courtiers, not I, who had tired of waiting for my departure. I believe that when Paul Reynolds returned to speak to Mr. X, the courtier had a game plan, however clumsy his execution of it. The firm's best interests could not be served if I went gently into the night. They needed to cut me off at the knees, abort my future options, destroy my standing with the Queen. The firm also needed to send a warning to Diana to keep her in the fold and shore up the monarchy. My public vivisection would be a pointed reminder. This is what happens if you cross us. They did indeed scare the daylights out of my sister-in-law, who was now afraid to be seen with me, and I could not blame her. Nor could I fault the firm for sharpening its knives, because I knew they were right about me. Even when their facts were wrong, they were right. I was a despicable human being. I had failed the monarchy single-handedly. Now, at last, the whole country was on to me. They knew exactly how awful I was. And how could a whole country be wrong? There could be no question of staying at Sunning Hill. The girls and I would leave, and quickly. My in-laws proposed that we move down the drive and into the keeper's house, a 2-room cottage with a bathroom outside. A lick of paint and it'll be fine, the Duke of Edinburgh said. I might have been blown away by recent events, but I wasn't that defeated, not when my children were concerned. I rented a house nearby called Remenda Lodge, on the Wentworth Golf Course. My housing allowance wouldn't cover our expenses, and my overdraft would bulge like an old bicycle tire, but so be it. I kept up my manic pace. I still had my office at the palace, and no shortage of appointments to buzz around to. On March the 23rd, Andrew and I threw a party at Sunning Hill for Eugenie's 2nd birthday. It wasn't so easy to put on my happy family face, but I managed. I could always manage those things. Inside, however, I was terrified. My old questions started catching up to me. What am I doing? What have I done? Am I really the person I read about in the papers? And if not, who am I? My new life was laden with many fears, but none more frightening than my freedom. With freedom came choice and accountability for one's actions, an awful concept for someone with no confidence. For escape, I reverted to my old compulsive behaviors. My diet went haywire until I felt like a blob. I spent money as though I really had it. And then there was the binge that cost me most dear, John Bryan. Andrew and I first met John at a London dinner party in 1990. He'd been exploring high-technology investments with his father, a shrewd businessman. I was impressed by John's boldness and energy. He was a fountain of fresh ideas. After he outlined some ambitious possibilities for Budgie, I asked him to represent me in any film or television opportunities. On February 20th, 1992, John asked me to dinner. I was needy and full of doubts. He was attentive and breezily self-assured. I believed he was a fabulous tycoon, this brilliantly cosmopolitan man. I had no desire to peer beneath the surface to understand. I believed it all, as a child believes. By that spring, after the knives came out for Fergie, I was a shell-shocked and assassinated person. I couldn't call directory assistance. And in swept Mr. Worldly, who knew what time it was all over the globe. "Leave everything to me," he said, and I did. The more he did, the more he wanted to do. My intensity filled the sails of his self-importance. He played off my hyperactivity. He would come in and say, "Okay, this is how I can help you. I'll talk to the bank, I'll pay for this, don't worry about that." And I would think, I can relax. I was putty in his hands. When you are a breakdown person, There is nothing finer than someone who wants to take charge of your life. In June, John would ask for my power of attorney, which I willingly granted. I would have let him choose my dresses and plan my breakfasts if he'd cared to. One of my best friends took me aside and said, "Can't you see what he's doing? Can't you see?" But I was blinded by need. "You're wrong," I responded. "He's a wonderful man." In truth, John could be generous to a fault and a joy to be with. John's bluff command, I see now, cloaked his own insecurity. He was desperate for a big financial score and a secure niche among the glitterati. I was desperate for approval and affection. We were two people stuck in quicksand, immobilized by terror and confusion. Too weak or scared to reach out for a saving branch, we clung more tightly to one another, and we were doomed. I was desperate for escape. I took many trips that summer, with John always at the helm. Never had I run so hard from my pain. But the pain was more resourceful than the cleverest paparazzi, and in each new place it found me and tapped me on the shoulder, and I would move on to the next rush of novelty. Until August, when my fugitive feet would carry me to the south of France, and I would demonstrate for all time that running and hiding are two different things. To review the bidding, John Brown had booked our pink villa near Saint-Tropez under an assumed name. We flew in on a chartered plane. We were more than 2 miles off the road. There was no public access to the villa. We were sheltered by woods and hills, halfway up a private gravel track that led to an isolated vineyard. How, then, had I landed at the wrong end of a telephoto lens? 3 days after the photographs came out, the Sunday Express published a story headed, "Was Sarah set up?" The article posed the following questions. How did Daniele Agnelli, the paparazzo known as the hitman's hitman, know when we would be at the villa? How did Agnelli escape detection as he worked? And most intriguing, who had tipped him off? John found a partial answer the following week, when he returned to the villa and discovered a large trench within 100 yards of the villa and its pool. Judging from the size of the trench and the fact that Agnelli had shot me in several different bathing suits, the photographer and his assistant must have dug in and bivouacked there for at least 3 days, clicking away to their heart's content. This was an extraordinary find. It made tangible what we already knew, that the most basic rules for royal security had been breached. While I had forfeited any special treatment by separating, my daughters remained part of the royal family, in line to the throne. Whenever they travelled abroad, the host nation's security apparatus would automatically be notified to take appropriate steps. We had no such protection in the south of France in August 1992. After the scandal broke, French authorities reportedly voiced astonishment that they had received no word of our presence. Such negligence was unheard of. But the French were no more startled than I, because I knew that I had followed standard protocol. Several days before leaving for Saint-Tropez, I informed the Queen, as I always did. Circumstances suggest, therefore, that some paragon of bureaucratic efficiency failed to make the normal security arrangements. My suspicions further told me that the firm colluded with the press by leaking details of my whereabouts. The press then tipped off the French photo agency, and the deal was struck. As a result, our travelling party was next to defenceless. Had we been stalked by someone with a rougher agenda than Agnelli, we might have seen a different sort of headline. As I saw it, the firm had done a job on me, and done it well. I was routed and disgraced. I had been flung into spiritual exile. But one question remained. Had the firm done its duty? Had it truly served its sovereign by instigating what the tabloids called the biggest scandal since the abdication of 1936? They expelled me with a pipe bomb, when a small shove might have sufficed, and the monarchy still shakes from the aftershock. On September the 19th, 1992, 1 month after the Saint-Tropez photographs broke, I was scheduled to address the Motor Neurone Disease Association's annual conference in Birmingham. "I can't come," I told Peter Cardi, head of the association. "I'll resign. I can't come. I'm so ashamed and embarrassed." I hadn't made a public appearance since leaving Balmoral. I was a walking corpse, the Duchess in disgrace, and I was acting out the part each day. How could I possibly face the people who had trusted me, given me so much? I had dishonored their gratitude. I had let them all down. But Peter held me to my commitment. I went to Birmingham and walked into the lobby and stopped cold at the doorway to the large hall. I turned to Kevin Langdon, a very good friend, and I said, "Kevin, I can't walk in there." Kevin was a man to be reckoned with. He had been told he would never walk again, but refused to believe it. He is still walking today by sheer force of will. He looked straight at me and said, "If you don't bloody well get in that door, you've got me to deal with. What do you think most of the people here would give to walk into that room?" That shut me up. It was one of the blessings of being around people with MND. More trivial problems were put in their place. I went out on stage to hear Peter Cardy introduce me, and his speech was so moving, so generous, that I barely held my composure. And at the end of it, those 500 people, most of them in wheelchairs, began to applaud. It can be a great effort to put your hands together when you have MND, but those people kept on clapping. Then they rose, one by one, propped up by their carers, exhausting themselves in tribute. They did not care about my scandal or my trail of destruction. They were connecting with me, the person who'd always met them at their level, and now they were returning the favor. I was seasoned enough on the public stage to know it was a ridiculous place for crying, but I could not stop myself. I let down my guard, and the tears streamed down my face. I felt more guilty and humble and contrite than ever in my life. These people were dying, yet they had rallied to make me feel better. They had forgiven me when I felt unforgivable, when I could not forgive myself. For the royal family, Annus Horribilis ended as it had begun, with calamity. In November, a fire at Windsor Castle caused $80 million in damage. In December, Diana and Charles finally announced their separation, a huge blow to the monarchy, even though everyone knew it was coming. But for me, the year ended with a whiff of grace and opportunity. I attended a polo match to benefit Angels International, where a woman named Theo Ellett told me about the charity's work in Upper Silesia, the industrial center of Poland. By the time the match ended, I knew that I wanted to help. There are many bad places for children to live in this world, but Upper Silesia ranks high on any list. Whole forests have been killed by the sulfur and coal that spew from countless polluting smokestacks. Death wafts through the very air. The region has the highest infant mortality rate in Europe. In the Katowice area, half of the 4-year-olds are chronically ill. Just before Christmas, Theo invited me to join her in an inspection of the leukemia ward at Zabcha Children's Hospital. It was a place of terrible want. The young patients had no blankets or sheets, no medicine or bandages, no toys or posters or the least bit of colour in their life. They had nothing. Nothing. There were 2 makeshift incubators, and if a third baby needed one, that baby died. End of story. For a person who cannot bear it when her daughter gets stung by a wasp, this was a life-changing experience. In Poland, I was baptized into a larger world. I had found greater need than I'd ever seen before, a great scandal of need. I had to rethink what scandal really meant. My own now seemed laughable, much ado about very little. Upon returning to England, I began working with Angels on a major fundraiser. A month or 2 before the event, however, the organization withdrew. Some of its officers feared they might get tarred by working too closely to me. They wanted to pull the plug, but I was stubborn. The children at Zabcha still needed that money. If Angels was unwilling, I would do it myself. I would start my own charity. That was the genesis of Children in Crisis. Theo left to join me and became our executive director, and we scrambled to get registered in time for our March event. We raised nearly $50,000 that night, and that is when our real work began. Over the next 3 years, Children in Crisis would raise $7 million. We spent just 7% on administration and overhead, 1/3 the industry norm. In those early months, I underwrote any shortfalls myself. If we had promised to send out $4,000 a month in fresh fruits and vegetables to Bosnia, we never missed a shipment, regardless of our bank statement. The giving was a gift to me as well. I still felt my old buzz, but now it had focus and foundation. By 1998, our work in Poland should be self-sustaining, fully staffed and funded by the people who live there, which in turn will free our London operation, the mothership, to move in somewhere else. Even as I immersed myself in my work with Children in Crisis, a little gnat would come buzzing in my ear. In early 1993, Diana and I were characterized as two bad women by one of the tabloid's palace sources. The Grey men were troubled, you see. The erstwhile merry wives of Windsor might soon be gay divorcees. We'd be out of the family and a good riddance too, but also outside the courtier's control. To keep us from flexing new muscles, the firm did its level best to isolate us. Any friends seen in our company suddenly appeared in the papers, in articles that were less than flattering. One wealthy American was explicitly warned not to see us. He must treat us, he was told, as though we had AIDS. Then there were the actions that spoke louder than words. Chris Hutchins, a reporter for Today, wrote that going back to 1990, tips about my whereabouts abroad had been fed to his newspaper over the phone or via clandestine meetings. In the view of Chris Hutchins, the informants were uniformly well-dressed, well-spoken, and obviously well-placed. He pegged them as members of the Secret Service. I know that MI5 tapped my telephones and analysed the recordings at their listening centre at Cheltenham. As confirmed by a former MI6 officer, the Secret Service had a special unit to monitor the royal family, all, of course, in defence of the realm. When their taps came up empty, they had to trap me by some other means, fair or foul. Early in 1993, I paid a secret visit to my lawyer in London to discuss a divorce and how it might play out for me. A few days later, the lawyer's office was burgled. Some weeks later, at Remender Lodge, I came across a strange-looking worm, crouched under the wicker fence and aimed at my house. Upon closer inspection, the worm turned out to be a miniature camera, fixed to the end of a doctor's proctoscope. The symbolism is all too obvious. At first, Andrew hated it when I talked about these things. He'd grown up in the palace as the fair-haired boy, after all. Massively indulged, massively protected. How could the firm wish to harm me? Why was I talking such nonsense? Don't be so suspicious, he would say. It wouldn't be like that. Or even, you are so oversensitive and paranoid, you are completely and utterly wrong. Gradually, however, Andrew's scepticism would soften. After the Squidgy tapes and Camilla Gate, and the divulgence of one of our own taped phone calls, my charges no longer seemed far-fetched. Over time, as my husband faced the firm's ruthlessness firsthand, he would come to share my suspicions. He would arrive at the same conclusion as James Whittaker had in his book, Royal Blood Feud. That forces were at work to destabilize the royal family suddenly seemed to be distinctly possible, in fact very probable. The firm may have written me off, but I refused to spend the next months in idleness. With the invaluable help of Benita Stoney, I researched and wrote Travels with Queen Victoria, which retraced the monarch's journeys abroad. I became completely absorbed in the work, and the book itself won warm critical praise when it came out in September 1993. But my understanding of and empathy with Queen Victoria plagued me. I had come to understand what duty meant to her, and sacrifice. I felt I had let her down, and betrayed this great tradition of monarchy. It was a small step toward consciousness, and it hurt. As president of McIntyre Care, a group that promotes independent living for the disabled, I convinced my friend Ali Brown to join my group on a trek. We were out to dramatize the fact that disabled people can lead productive, challenging lives. Out of our group of climbers, 8 were disabled. In October 1993, we flew to Nepal and climbed to the top of Polkadi Peak, more than 19,000 feet high. Standing at the summit, I felt a great calm. Life seemed so much larger and more important than the sum of my own travails. A week after returning from Polkadi, I turned on the BBC and caught a vision of hell. The subject was a state orphanage in Albania, and its nightmare images were out of Hieronymus Bosch. In an unheated building, where people's breath frosted the air, naked children were tied to filthy cots. They drank from the drains and ate off the floor. Excrement was everywhere. Babies lay neglected with bulging rags around their bottoms. Their bodies wept with sores. Rats rustled underfoot, unafraid. I was staggered by the program. Before it had even ended, I telephoned the news reporter, a man named Bill Hamilton, and said to him, "I cannot bear this. Are there really children going through all this?" And he said, "Yes, there are." "Can we go and see it?" I asked. "We're going in 3 days." "Yes, I'm coming." Albania is the poorest country in Europe. Per capita, its Ministry of Health spent $10 per year. But even Albania was not impervious to pressure. By the time we arrived, the government had closed the state orphanage. One child was dead from exposure. The rest had been dispersed to slightly less horrendous places. Packed into a rattletrap minibus, we tracked down each of those children. They were okay. Just. It was past 7 p.m. when we finished our last inspection, deep in the rain-sodden Albanian countryside, hours from the capital, Tirana. I was about to board our bus when I heard the strangest sounds coming from a barn-like building 50 yards off. Ankle-deep in water, we approached it down a concrete path. Soon I could make the sounds out. They were screams and wails, high-pitched and haunting, a chorus of torment. We had driven bad roads for 2 days, and the crew was exhausted. I turned to the cameraman and said, "We've got to go in there. I don't like the sound of it." One of the men and I started banging on these wooden doors. We were ready to bash them down if a nurse hadn't opened them. She told us, "You can't come in here." But we pushed right by her, camera and all, and we were in. How do I express what I saw in that barn? More than 50 women with shaved heads were crammed into 3 rooms, meant to hold perhaps 10 of them. It was cold and damp, but the women were unclothed, save for a few shreds of nightgowns. They lay on iron beds, and they used the floor for a lavatory. These women had bruises everywhere. The nurses were apparently free with their fists. The conditions were so wretched that the patients had to be continuously sedated. There was only one needle, so everyone shared. The facility was supposed to house the terminally ill, but I am convinced that political prisoners were mixed in as well. One woman spoke fluent English, which was rare in those parts. With not enough beds to go around, most of the patients got what little creature comfort they could by having sex with one another. I felt chilled in my sweatshirt, and knew the naked woman in front of me must be freezing. I took off my sweatshirt and gave it to her. The nurse scolded me. "Don't do that. She'll get beaten up for that shirt. She's better off not to have anything." She was harsh and pitiless, that nurse, and I guessed who might do the beating. Eventually we were thrown out, though not before we had enough footage for another BBC exposé. I learned then and there the value of the impromptu visit, that if you do only what is scheduled and officially permitted, you run the risk of legitimizing some shameful situations. In Tirana, I met with President Berisha and told him what I had seen. He seemed glad to know of it, but I think that I startled him, just a bit. I might still be a coward in fighting for myself, but I could fight for others. Of course, I continued my work with Children in Crisis, the Motor Neuron Disease Association, and other charities. In the 12 months ending July the 1st, 1995, Majesty magazine would report that I travelled more than 200,000 miles for my charities, nearly 3 times as far as the second-placed royal, the Duke of Edinburgh. After years of fundraisers, I came to feel embarrassed about going to America for British causes. It was too colonial for my tastes. America is a special land for me. I find the people incredibly giving and forgiving. They are disinclined to judge. If you are pleased to be with them, then they are pleased to see you, as simple as that. When I toured the States on official visits, people seemed to respond to the person I really was. They'd call me Fergie or Sarah or Princess Ferguson, whatever worked for them. Protocol didn't matter. They were just happy to see this mass of red hair come flying through their door. As I look back, I got similar receptions in Australia and almost everywhere else. It was only at home that I felt a stranger. I wanted to give something back to a country that had supported me through thin and thinner. In December 1994, we established Chances for Children. To make sure the new baby stayed afloat, I pledged my own money to help cover costs for the first year. Our first case involved Rhonda Armstrong, a 14-year-old immigrant from Guyana who had been blinded by a brain tumor pressing on her optic nerve. Unless the tumor was removed, doctors warned she might be dead within days. Chances for Children donated $15,000 toward Rhonda's operation at the Montefiore Medical Center, where they removed a tumor the size of a chicken egg. A few days after the surgery, I came to visit her. Rhonda had just been moved from intensive care. Almost as I walked into the room, she opened her eyes and said, "Dear God, I can see." A handful of moments are indelible. The birth of one's children, the death of a parent. My moment with Rhonda was one of those. We had given that sweet girl an extra year of life. I still keep her picture by my bed. I can still hear her greeting the light, as if she was seeing for the first time. In October 1995, the newspaper The Mail on Sunday confirmed my never-ending exile with the headline, "The Queen will keep Fergie out of the limelight." It wasn't so bad to be an exile, most of the time. It made life a lot simpler, not to mention one's wardrobe decisions. But there were times when it made me feel lonely unto death, and the worst was at Yuletide. Ever since my separation, I had dutifully taken Beatrice and Eugenie to Sandringham at Christmas time. As Christmas of 1995 came knocking, I crept to the door with more than uncommon dread. As usual, the girls and I stayed at Wood Farm, a comfortable open-beamed cottage 2 miles from the big house. At 4:30 in the afternoon, snow or shine, Andrew came to pick up Beatrice and Eugenie and take them to the big house for tea with their cousins and the Queen. When they came back to me, my daughters had an air of haughtiness. It would take me a while to get them back down. Over 2 full weeks, I was not invited once to the big house, not for tea, nor a drink, nor a bowl of breakfast porridge. "Mummy," Beatrice said one day, "why are you not good enough to go up there?" I tried to explain that their granny would love for me to be with them, but that I wasn't so well thought of by certain other members of the family. My daughters seemed satisfied with that. As long as I was always there for them when they came back, they were fine. For me, the roughest time, as you might expect, was the holiday itself. Andrew and I kept our own small holiday tradition. After lunch, when I had my standard Christmas turkey burgers with the 2 policemen and the cook, my husband came down to Wood Farm. At 7:30 he got up to leave, grousing about having to change for dinner, and I was, again, alone. As I have noted, I was always a good spender. I kept on spending after my separation, and my 6-figure debt soon added another 0. Given my accustomed lifestyle and the level of my income, a certain deficit was built in. Given my state of mind and the proclivities of the people around me, my overdraft flourished, mushroomed, metastasized. In January 1995, my daughters and I moved from Rumenda Lodge to Kingsbourne. Our rent stayed the same, but our new home had been vacant and damaged by rain, and I had to invest quite a lot to make it habitable. I might not have sunk so far, if I had had money coming in on the other side of the ledger. But that was the rub. From 1992 to 1995, my business income had sunk into negative numbers. Early on, John Bryan had negotiated a contract with me to exploit Budgie on television and in merchandising. I'd started a company years earlier, ASB Publishing, for Andrew, Sarah, Beatrice. John continually talked about future ventures, waiting just around the corner, which would turn ASB into the second coming of Disney. I believed him. I wanted to believe that John would do it, that he was this immensely successful businessman who was putting his genius to work for me. With my power of attorney, he didn't even have to consult me before signing contracts, and I thought that was great. It made life so much easier. Except for one problem. John's big score never materialized. At the end, ASB was a 6-figure loser. In the summer of 1995, John left England for good, and we would sever our last business ties by August of that same year. By that time, my overdraft had reached the stratosphere, over $5 million. It so happened that I was getting healthier at the time. I was taking control of my affairs. I had trimmed my home expenditures, been obliged to lay off some staff. On the income side, several strong projects were in the pipeline. I was growing more conscious by the day, and, quite sensibly, more panicked. It was as if I'd been napping on the railway tracks, and bestirred myself with the locomotive 20 yards away. I was aware of the danger, no question, but had I awakened in time? By November, I had to get approval from the bank to issue checks to pay the florist or the grocer. I seriously thought I was about to go bankrupt, and it was at that point that I rang an American friend of mine. I told him, I'm in the mud, and I'm about to sink, and I'm holding my hand out. Will you take my hand? Where others had wavered, or been scared off, this man said he would be there. In return for future considerations on Budgie, he would try to save me. By December, a rescue was in motion to restructure my debt. By January, a three-way deal had evolved among Coots, the American group, and myself. On their part, the firm assured us that they were with me and supportive of the deal. Maybe that is the point where I should have smelled a palace rat, because on January the 17th, just before the deal was set, the firm released the following press statement. The Duchess's financial affairs are no longer Her Majesty's concerns. These are matters which the Duchess of York must discuss and resolve with her bankers and other financial advisers. The Duchess's business ventures are conducted quite separately from any royal duties. That statement triggered a bank run on my account. Everyone from the butcher to the airlines demanded immediate payment. My office phones rang like a telethon. Stern letters from lawyers flooded the mails. But my American friend held firm through the storm. On January the 20th, my office made public an agreement which provides for a solid base for the activities of Her Royal Highness the Duchess of York and ensures the payment of creditors. I still have a big overdraft, but I'm paying every penny back. The firm had done its best to torpedo my rescue. It had tried to ram me down so far that I would never break the surface, never gain my own power. But the firm had failed. Now the rest would be up to me. Betrayals are a part of public life, no more to be escaped than zoom lenses or false rumors. I would like to tell you that I've hardened to them, that they are water off my back. But I haven't, and they aren't. It is one thing to be pounded by some anonymous newspaper editor. It is another to be broadsided by someone you have known and liked and trusted as a friend. After Children in Crisis was reorganized in the summer of 1994, Theo Ellett was asked to take a different position. She quit instead. A few months later, Theo made a deal with the Daily Mirror to fund her latest charity. She sold her version of my so-called intimate secrets, such as, Fergie says bald men are good in bed, for $15,000. Then she set up a number where people could call in and eavesdrop on 2 gushy recorded messages I'd left for her, 49 pence a minute. The terrible thing about living in a fishbowl is not just that people are watching, but that they distract from what you need to do. Theo sold our friendship to the press at a fragile time for me. While I'd made progress on my slow road to self-awareness, I still had far to travel. I needed to keep looking inside myself, and more deeply than before. But the observation deck was getting rather crowded, and that was before my dear father elbowed his way aboard. In October 1994, excerpts of Dad's new autobiography, The Galloping Major, My Life in Singular Times, were published in the tabloids. In addition to sundry nuggets of polo lore, Dad had written a fair amount about his celebrated younger daughter, the kind of material he needed to earn a sizable advance and to cover some pressing debts. The Galloping Major took on the backbiting toadies at the firm. It also weighed the trials of being a Windsor wife and speculated about my future with Andrew. That book left me feeling totally forlorn, irretrievably alone. And it wasn't the content of what Dad had written. It was the fact that he had traded upon our relationship for a few £1,000s, without so much as consulting with me. He had taken my most cherished possession, my privacy, and auctioned it off, as though it was his seignorial right. When he realized how upset I was, he asked me, what do you want me to say? I could only answer, nothing, Dads. There's nothing you can do. When you war with a parent, you lose twice. First from the conflict, then from the alienation. You are cut off from a person who gave you life. You are cut off from a part of yourself. I ultimately forgave Dad's, but for a time his book carved a deep rift between us. For years after my separation, I remained in limbo, legally, financially, emotionally. Neither Andrew nor I had wanted to make the decision, but we could not rest on the fence forever. We had to go one way or the other, either reconcile or part, and the cards were all stacked on one side of the table. It would be hard to divorce Andrew. We had no animosity between us. If anything, we were better friends than before. I had to lose my prince, it seemed, to rediscover the man. I might never find another to believe in me as Andrew did. I knew, too, that my husband would not have denied me if I had asked him to try again. Unconditional love is like that. It is always there for you. But I had crossed my Rubicon many miles earlier. Speaking practically, I could not satisfy the bank's demands unless I became wholeheartedly commercial. As a separated mother with 2 children, my goal was to be self-sufficient, and I could not get there as a member of the royal family. There were just too many things not done. My freedom had been too hard won to relinquish. I needed to fashion a career without wavering or apology. In the end, though, my decision wasn't swung by the bottom line. Life as a princess was just too much for me, and at the same time too little. I wanted more from a marriage than a prince could offer. I wanted a companion who would give me 110%, and I would give the same. But you cannot ask that of a man whose mother was the monarch. You cannot press a man for whom duty must come first, and second, and third, and fourth as well. Had Andrew not been quite so high-born, it might have been different for us. But the facts were the facts. It had taken a small eternity for me to understand this, but once I learned something, I was never one to fiddle around. I told Andrew it was time, and we agreed to do it quickly and quietly. That Easter, the girls and I stayed for 6 days at Sunning Hill with their father. We painted eggs and had treasure hunts, all the usual things, and much more of the time we simply relaxed at home. We had 2 sensational children, Andrew and I, and it never hurt to be reminded of it. If you had to enter marriage, this was a good way to do it. On Thursday, April 11th, I left Sunning Hill in floods of tears. I would be a spigot all day long. Andrew was outwardly unemotional as he saw me and the girls off in a car. His own turn would come later. I had to steel myself to sign the grey document. My hand felt like some lifeless machine as it made the familiar scrawl. You are doing the right thing, my head told me. But there are certain acts you can't be sure of until after you've done them. I was skydiving that day. I had checked my chute 12 times inside the plane, but who knew for sure that it would open when I needed it, when the ground would rush up to receive me. On Wednesday, April 17th, 29 uncontested divorces were processed at the Family Division of the High Court in London. At the bottom of the list was this one: HRH the Duke of York versus HRH the Duchess of York. A week later, Andrew and I would have dinner with both lawyers and their wives at a restaurant near Windsor. We were really setting new standards of amicability. Back home in Kingsbourne, I plunged into melancholy. I was wretched, inconsolable, well past hysterics, not far from coma. When Andrew first came to me, he was my total hero. For somebody who needed an awful lot of love, he served. He had taken a girl who was terrified of life, and he'd said, "You can do it. You're all right. Go on, you can do it." He never told me to trust myself, not in so many words, but by his actions he had given me faith to carry on. And now he was gone, leaving this great hole inside me. He'd left a pain too large to run from any longer, for the pain was now all I had, all I was. It was the pain of being born. Consciousness was a new medium for me. I would still get sidetracked into alleys of self-hatred or dead ends of regret. I still blanched at my old behavior. But there was something else rattling around in there, a new glimmer of understanding, even a hint of self-love. After months out of touch, I thought I had seen the last of John Bryan. But on Sunday, April 28th, he reached out for me like some horror movie hand reaching from the crypt, just when I thought I might be safe at last. That morning, readers of News of the World were treated to the following front page, World War headline. I had sex with Fergie as she spoke to Andy on phone. I was still very much in my rocking chair phase, feeling about as rugged as a robin's egg, and that headline knocked me for 6. Would everyone believe that I would do this disgusting thing? I went upstairs and washed my face, and then I sat in a chair to think for a bit. Why do these things keep happening? I could rage about John in the tabloids, but only one person had brought this upon me. I'd just seen her streaked face in the mirror. Taking responsibility, for good and bad alike, is a salve for the spirit. It makes for a clear-eyed optimism. If a certain sort of conduct gets you into a mess, a change can get you out. You have control over what happens next. And so I got out of my chair and found my wonderful girls. I took each of them by the hand and led them to their trampoline. As we jumped, I left my anger and humiliation behind me, below me. There was no point in dwelling on that article. I wasn't about to sue and clamber into a witness box. John's betrayal was a sad thing, but it was also a catharsis. It swept the decks clean. There was nothing left in my unconscious past that could harm me. After we'd had our fill of jumping, Beatrice and Eugenie went to swim, and I sat by the pool watching them. Bees buzzed about the swaying daffodils. Our 2 Dalmatians eyed the cat as it meandered by. What was more real, the crass fantasies of a desperate man, or the natural world the Lord had given us? Yesterday's history, tomorrow's a mystery, and today is a gift. I watched my daughters swim on. The sun softly nestled on my back, and in that one invaluable, irreplaceable moment, my mind was as clear as the warm spring air. I am so grateful for my daughters, these precious gems. I can't imagine my house without their vibrancy and laughter and grumpiness. Beatrice is musical and full of grace. She wears her heart on her sleeve, and she has a higher understanding of life than anyone else I've ever met. Eugenie is clever academically and appears light-hearted and easy, but she can surprise with her intensity, and she is fearlessly candid. She will go up to the Queen and say that she doesn't like Granny's lipstick. Sometimes I have to remind myself that a parent is but a guardian, and that only for a time. I cannot swathe my children in cotton wool for protection. They have their own lessons to learn, as I have had mine, and will have many more. I will be honest and consistent with them, above all. My daughters have always heard the truth from their mother about the separation and the divorce, and so they're not embarrassed when it comes up at school. I never wanted a fishbowl for my children, but you cannot wish the world away. From hard experience, I have found it is best to take the press in stride, that you only compound its feeding frenzy by trying to escape. When my girls go outside and see some cameras, they smile sweetly and get on with their day. They are growing up quite normally, I think. I set limits, to be sure, but I try not to knock the stuffing out of them. You need to let children be children. But my daughters also need to see children who have suffered, to see how lucky they are. When we held a party near Kingsbourne for children in crisis, they met a remarkable boy from Chernobyl. Igor was 7, barely 2 feet tall, with little flipper-like legs and only one arm. Beatrice and Eugenie took him down the garden, and off they went. Igor was just one of the gang. Children in Crisis coordinates the World Appeal for the Children of Chernobyl. It will be one of our major concentrations in years to come. 10 years after the nuclear disaster that resulted in radioactive fallout 100 times greater than Hiroshima, more than 800,000 children in the Republic of Belarus remain at high risk. They are prone to a grotesque litany of diseases, leukemia and other cancers of all kinds, birth deformities and Down syndrome, thyroid problems and anemia, mental sickness and blindness. Few of these children are getting the most basic medical treatment, much less needed chemotherapy. Drugs are expensive or unavailable. A packet of aspirin costs the equivalent of 2 weeks' wages. At places like Chernobyl, the challenge can seem overwhelming, but we will do our best, child by child. Despite significant pressure from the firm, Andrew has stood tall in my support. When we recently met in public, he kissed me in front of all the press. He wanted to make it clear that he had not been intimidated. Today, Andrew is totally different from the young man who teased me at Royal Ascot. He is awake, in the most vital sense. He is truly amazing. My loyal friend Kenneth Rose, the biographer of George V, once noted that real royalty is not just a matter of titles or crowns. To be royal is to be compassionate, to put people at their ease, to be connected to the deeper meaning of life. By all of these measurements, Andrew is royal, not merely by birth, but by character. Whichever lady gets him now is one very lucky lady. I am easier with myself these days, more forgiving, more content. I have learned, for example, that there is life after cellulite. When I'm in the company of a model, I don't wish to have her figure. I've got my own, and it's perfectly nice. It's me after all. I know I am a work in progress, and that I'm sure to make mistakes, but risk no longer troubles me. I'm ready to stand up for what I think is right. As a free and independent divorced woman, I will do what is required to support my family. And if that means writing a book or endorsing a product or opening a television channel for Fox, so be it. I must tell you this. Given the chance, I would follow my heart again, all the way into Buckingham Palace. I would not change a day of it, not even that hellish day at Balmoral when I felt like Eve fallen from grace. I would go through it all again, to the last tabloid humiliation, because it led me to the path that saved my life. Once upon a time, a country girl fell into public life and lost herself in the exchange. She finally had to demolish her public self, if only to rescue her private one. And that is exactly what she did, in all of her unconsciousness. Which is to say, I had to let go of something huge to win, for Andrew and myself. I was never cut out for royalty, even had I known what I know today. But history cannot be erased. I can never go back through the looking glass into some pristine private life. I will always be the mother of 2 princesses and the second son's ex-wife. There are gossip page fixtures with slimmer resumes than that. But today, I can weather the scrutiny. Take it or leave it as I please. I have something larger and more lasting than the latest 3-column spread. I am my own woman now, ready to go forward. I have my own life back, and I will not let go of it. And I just might live rather happily ever after.
My Story was written by Sarah the Duchess of York, with Jeff Copeland, and read by Sarah the Duchess of York. It was abridged for audio by Jan Werner. The recording engineer was Paul Fowley, with editing and post-production by Common Mode, Paul Fowley, technical director. The mix engineer was Rick Bradley. The associate producer was Florence Barreau Adams. My Story was produced and directed by Susan Perrin. This has been a presentation of Simon & Schuster Audio. My Story is also available in hardcover from Simon & Schuster.